Chapter 707. The roaring of the world was only because of the energy reaction under the emotional fluctuations. While Yuanwu was in trouble due to his injuries, he had the presence of having the world under his feet. Qianmu bowed his head slightly. He knew even more that no matter how much he hated Yuanwu, he could not win against someone like this. This medicine is very dangerous. Su Fu's fingers moved slightly, as though he had touched the energy in the gravestone. His expression changed. He had been searching for medicines overseas for a long time for Yuanwu and naturally understood medicine. At this time, while this medicinal energy contained astounding changes in his perception and caused his flesh and blood to feel an eagerness to try, he also sensed that this medicinal energy had a holy and deathly stillness, completely different from the liveliness of the top spirit medicines he had encountered in the world. Yuanwu nodded, indicating that he had heard clearly. He did not immediately express his stance, just reached out and touched the gravestone. The moment his hand touched the black gravestone, it was immediately filled with blinding golden holy light. The black gravestone gave off hostility as though it was about to explode. But his hand pressed tightly on the black gravestone. The black gravestone was unable to move amidst the vibrations. The golden holy light seeped into the black gravestone. He used a dozen breaths to sense it, and his expression grew stranger. So the so-called Wuji ancestral mountain's elixir of immortality is something like this. Then he looked at Qianmu, as though he already knew Ding Ning's arrangements. He said, "The medicinal power is at most half. The other half is to be returned to Miss Shang and then given to me. The other half is with Fu Su, and will be given to you along with Fu Su." Really? Yuanwu raised an eyebrow. His expression usually did not change much. Many times, other than the majesty of a monarch, he just appeared simple and honest. But when he raised an eyebrow, there was an indescribable pride. Then he said simply, "I agree to this condition." Qianmu was slightly shocked. He had not expected Yuanwu to agree so readily. But in the next moment, his heart sank. He felt that this was the presence Yuanwu should have. Only a person like this could win against the former Wang Jingming and the master who had killed him. Such a person seemed to be as simple and unadorned as a rock. Yet, he was very frightening. Yuanwu did not look at Qianmu. He did not think about how to exchange for Miss Shang and Fu Su. In his view, these were things that Ding Ning should be thinking about. The eternal and deathly energy in the Wuji ancestral mountain's elixir of immortality should have come from beyond the heavens and contained the scent of eroding one's mind. This kind of medicine that should not belong to this world was what he needed to consider. Burning incense, praying to the Grand Master, locking the doors and windows. In the Thunderfire Taoist temple, the middle-aged Taoist took every step very carefully. He knew that if he left today, he might not be able to return for a long time. He might never be able to return. Ding Ning patiently watched him do all this. The middle-aged Taoist's appearance made his eyes shine brighter and brighter and reminded him more and more of his senior brothers in the back mountain of the Bazankendo ground. This was definitely an unexpected surprise. This middle-aged Taoist had the same unique temperament as his senior brothers. "You are the only one left in the Thunderfire Taoist temples." After the middle-aged Taoist finished all this, he asked, "What are you called?" "Master gave me the name Shouchen." The middle-aged Taoist said, 5 years after the change in Chongling, the second year after Yuanwu ascended the throne, plagues broke out in the commanderies around my Thunderfire Taoist temple. Half of the people in my Thunderfire Taoist temple were infected and died. The cultivators could not resist the plague. At the time, we were the laughingstock of the Qi. Originally, there were more than a dozen sect brothers left, but they all left. Only I remained. Ding Ning looked at him and said, "Your cultivation is at least realm 5. Naturally, it is not a problem for you to make a living. But I see that your blood and energy are not strong. You do not seem to have enough food. Why is that?" "Some sects have pushed aside my Thunderfire Taoist temple. My master died in such a matter. If someone in court had not received his favor, this sect would not have been kept. But after my master died, the Thunderfire Taoist temple did not enjoy the benefits of a cultivation place in the Qi. The taxes on the fields and the mountains were very heavy. The land that this sect occupied seemed to have been rented with a lot of money. This Taoist called Shochin explained, "I tried my best. In the past years, I taught many disciples, but when they had some achievements, they were borrowed by other sections." Ding Ning was silent for a long moment and said, "Why do you still keep that letter?" The Thunderfire Taoist temple is just an ordinary cultivation place. In the beginning, the ancestral master was just a wandering Taoist. Coincidentally, he helped the country gentry here defeat bandits, so he was asked to stay and open this sect. Generation after generation. At most, he helped people with rituals, used energy to heal people, calm their nerves, and remove evil energy. There was nothing glorious worth mentioning. But the once invincible Wang Jingming sent a letter and noticed an insignificant cultivation place like ours. This is true glory. Also, if not for the astounding energy in the words of the letter, my master may have thought it was a prank from another sect. Shochin took a deep breath and looked at Ding Ning. Then he slowly said, "My master said, for this letter, he will pass down this Taoist temple. To be able to guard this Taoist temple like this, your master's greatest glory is not receiving my letter, but choosing a direct disciple like you." Ding Ning looked at him and was even more certain that he was similar to the senior sect brothers of the Bazin Kendo ground. Shochin did not speak. He reached into his sleeve and took out a jade box and then opened it. Ding Ning stilled slightly. The jade box that Shochin took out from his sleeve was the best Dushan jade. This kind of jade was naturally warm and had the ability to block energy. Even more importantly, this kind of jade was very expensive and did not fit in with this dilapidated Taoist temple. The jade box had 5 layers. When Shochin opened it, Ding Ning saw 5 Taoist seals, each different. The Taoist seals of the Thunderfire Taoist temple were in the truest sense the oldest Taoist seals in the world of cultivators. The seals themselves were made from special materials, and the seals were drawn using special metals or jade powders mixed with other treasures that could gather large amounts of primal energies of the universe. The power of these Taoist seals came mostly from the seals themselves. The vital energy of the cultivators and their unique methods of making seals were equivalent to lighting these seal candles. The greatest disadvantage of a legacy, like the Thunderfire Taoist temple, was that these Taoist seals would often be killed by flying swords before they could be used. So in the world of cultivators, it evolved into Celestial Seal Sect's method of forming seals with vital energy. But at this time, even though these 5 Taoist seals were in the jade box that blocked energy, in Ding Ning's eyes, they shone brightly and shocked him. Chapter 708. Shochin knew very well why Ding Ning was shocked at this moment. He held the jade box as if he was holding the entire weight of the sect, so he spoke even more slowly. "Just as you know, the Seal Dao of my Thunderfire Taoist temple is different from other Seal Dao sections. We mainly rely on external materials. However, the Seal Dao of my sect is superior to other sections. For example, some materials that are useless to other sects, some crystal powder that cannot be used to create artifacts, some bones of ancient spirit beasts, and even some resin condensed from enormous spirit trees can be used to create seals. However, while these different materials can be used as primers to gather large amounts of primal energies of the world according to our Thunderfire Taoist Temple Seal Dao, the different materials have to go through countless trials and deliberations, and the success rate is extremely low. In the eyes of my sect, there are some important materials that are regarded as treasures, but in the eyes of many other sects, they are worthless trash. Previously, my sect storehouse had accumulated a lot of these materials, but because the success rate was extremely low, coupled with the fact that our ancestral masters didn't pay much attention to them, they were limited by their true essence cultivation methods and talisman casting methods. No matter how powerful a talisman was, it wouldn't be able to increase its power by much. So why would they pursue the best materials to make the best talisman? Before receiving your letter, all of the ancestral masters thought so. This is a problem of perception. Our Thunderfire Taoist temple had many ancestral masters who wanted to find vital energy cultivation methods that could complement our talisman Dao. Unfortunately, our Taoist temple did not come into contact with so many cultivation methods, and we have never had someone like you who could see almost all the cultivation methods in the world. So later on, our perception was that there could not be a cultivation method more suitable for our talisman Tao. At this point, Shochin was silent for a long time. Then he slowly said, "But your letter changed everything. My master heard the news of the Bazin Kindo ground's destruction before he reached Chongling, but when he returned to the temple, he spent all of his time making seals. Even if he could not find a better method in his life, and even if he found one, he did not know how to merge it. But in his view, since this existed, he had to leave something useful for the Thunder Fire Temple. So he left behind 2 seals. I've made 3, but that doesn't mean that I'm better than my master. Many of my methods are based on my master's research." Ding Ning's gaze left the talismans. He looked up at the humble Taoist and nodded. "These 5 talismans are enough to bring glory to the Thunder Fire Taoist Temple." As Shochin closed the jade box, he inexplicably thought of the story where this Ding Ning had taken Shui Wanshu to participate in the Min Mountain Sword Trials. After that, White Goat Cave became famous throughout the world. Shochin knew that he didn't need such glory, but his sect did. So he bowed deeply to Ding Ning again and said, "I will not doubt your words because you have brought glory to Thunder Fire Temple by coming here on the dragon." The soaring serpent was still circling in the air, the black clouds twisting into all kinds of strange shapes. Just like Shochin said, almost everyone knew that Ding Ning was going to Jiaodong Commandery. Yet today, he had entered the Qi border and especially come to Thunderfire Temple. This caused countless people to be shocked and speculate. What was in that temple? In the cities closest to the mountain, all the Qi soldiers were on high alert. In one of the cities, Tian Yuza, one of the famous generals of the Qi dynasty, looked with a grave expression at the mountain shrouded in black clouds. Under the secret orders of the Qi emperor, the Qi dynasty and Zheng Xiu had worked together. Many powerful cultivators had added energy formations to the nether floats. This caused discontent in the dynasty, especially when the Qi army took the chance to invade the Chu lands. Many old generals and cultivators who had fought with the Chu against the Qin army expressed their discontent and anger at the Qi emperor by disarming and returning home. With the support of some youths and the benefits of taking the Chu lands back to the Qi dynasty, the situation of the Qi dynasty stabilized. Yet as the attack on the 9-Death Silkworm failed, Yuan Wu confirmed that the reborn 9-Death Silkworm had appeared in the Nanquan commanderies. Min Mountain Sword Sect had broken off relations with Chongling. Yin Ying's disciple was with Ding Ning and the others. When these news spread to the Qi lands, the voices of unease and opposition to the Qi emperor immediately spread and could not be stopped. Even in the eyes of a famous general like him who focused on the big picture, the Qi dynasty was in a dangerous situation. They had turned against the Bazin Kindo ground. If Consort Zhao led the hundreds of thousands of Chu troops into Jiaodong Commandery, then it would not just be the Zheng family that would be defeated by the Bazin Kindo ground, but all of Jiaodong Commandery would be taken over by the Bazin Kindo ground. From a strategic point of view, the Qi dynasty would be attacked from 3 sides by the Qin, Yin, and Jiaodong Commandery. The Yin dynasty had made their stance clear. They would be on the same side as the Bazin Kindo ground. If the Qin changed their minds, then the Qi dynasty would be isolated and helpless, and would be easily destroyed. As an important general of the dynasty, he would not criticize what had already happened, but had to consider how to avoid such an unfavorable situation. Like the Yin dynasty, to express goodwill to the Bazin Kindo ground? It was not just the Qi emperor who would not do this. Now, Ding Ning had entered the Qi lands, but had not made any contact with them. This meant that the Qi dynasty was an enemy in the eyes of the Bazin Kindo ground. Betrayal is the greatest crime for an ally. Once a mistake like this is made, even if you turn around and pay a price, you cannot regain the original trust. A voice rang out behind Tian Yuza. The one who spoke was also one of the famous generals of the Qi dynasty, the commander of the Ghost Army, one of the 3 strongest armies of the Qi dynasty, Lan Linxing. He clearly had the same opinion as Tian Yuza. Then he said in a cold voice, "The other has come to the Qi, but has not made contact with us." This means that they view the Qi dynasty as an enemy. To avoid being attacked from 3 sides in the future, It is best for us to urge His Majesty to send out troops to stop them, and not let the Bazinkindo ground and the Chu army take over Jiaodong Commandery. His Majesty is not stupid, but I do not understand why he has not acted. Tian Yuza nodded and turned to look at Lan Linxing. He said, but the Bazinkindo ground people have specially come here, as though they are not worried that the Qi dynasty will send out troops. I do not know what they plan to do, and what other moves they have. Lan Linxing was silent for a moment. Then he said softly and coldly, when the Qin was fighting the Han, Zhao, and Wei, I had helped the Wei and interacted with the Bazinkindo ground people. Wang Jingming and Lin Zhujiu working together. One in charge of war, the other in charge of the details, is terrifying. Chapter 709. Tian Yuza also grew silent. Wang Jingming and Lin Zhujiu. This was undoubtedly the strongest and most legendary pair in the history of war in the past hundreds of years. The Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, other than the Han dynasty itself being in a state of chaos and going downhill, the Zhao and Wei dynasties were unusually strong. But in just a dozen years, these three dynasties were swallowed up by the Qin dynasty. In those wars, no matter if it was a conspiracy or an open one, Wang Jingming and Lin Zhujiu were mostly involved. At that time, Yuan Wu was even ignored because this pair far surpassed all the famed generals of the time. Not just on the level of military matters, Lin Zhujiu's ability and meticulousness covered many other areas. He had close connections with many sects of the time, and even sects of other dynasties. At that time, Wang Jingming was said to have read all the cultivation manuals. At least half of the manuals were secret scrolls that cultivation places did not share. But these secret scrolls were able to reach Wang Jingming's hands because of Lin Zhujiu. Back then, all the generals of the Qin dynasty called Lin Zhujiu military advisor. But Lin Zhujiu's prestige and use back then was not just a military advisor. Based on reliable military intelligence, Lin Zhujiu had reached Jiaodong Commandery. Right now, Ding Ning was going to Jiaodong Commandery on the Dragon. This terrifying pair would meet again many years later. This was the most worrisome matter. Many years later, maybe Lin Zhujiu would be forgotten and ignored, but for generals like them, he could not be ignored. To the east of the outer sea of Jiaodong Commandery, within a dozen days to a month's journey, there were many islands with small countries on them. Some of the seas between these countries had once been the territory of some enormous sea beasts. Jiaodong Commandery spent thousands of years to kill most of the sea beasts and successfully tame some of the sea beasts like the soaring serpent. Especially after killing the mirages in the abyss at the bottom of the sea, these seas could be used for navigation, and some seas would not become grotesque because of the energy of these enormous beasts. But in the seas of Jiaodong Commandery, from the east to the north, there were many areas where cultivators rarely traveled. Even the Qin dynasty, who explored the seas the most, only had a general map of these places and could not even clearly mark how many islands there were. There were not just powerful sea beasts in these seas. There were also the cold winds and currents from the land of eternal ice in the north. The cold winds could easily cause unpredictable storms, and when the cold currents and warm currents met, the water currents under the sea would be turbulent and unpredictable. But who would have thought that the ancestors of Jiaodong Commandery had grasped some of the laws of the water? Who would have thought that the foundation of Jiaodong Commandery's 1,000 years was hidden in the depths of these seas? Lin Zhujiu was in these seas right now. Of Jiao Commandery, Jiao was the Jiao of Jiaodong. This kind of ship was the snail ship made by the ancestors of Jiaodong Commandery. When encountering any kind of sway, the cultivator on the ship only needed to use a bit of strength to firmly control the center of gravity of the ship, and it would be difficult to capsize in a storm. As long as they could keep a certain amount of fresh water and food on the ship, and even some of the medicines cultivators needed, they could survive and sail in these seas for a long time. But clearly, without the top-secret sea map of Jiaodong Commandery, almost no cultivator in the world could get close to the true foundation of Jiaodong Commandery. Because the ancestors of Jiaodong Commandery had spent hundreds of years, some of the already powerful and vicious sea beasts in these seas had become even more vicious, and even used seal weapons to make many dangerous traps under the sea. Many of the things that were truly hard to get close were because of people. In front of Lin Zhujiu, there was an area shrouded in white mist. The snail ship he and Zhang Shiwu were on was not deliberately controlled, and just floated with the natural currents. The white mist moved with the currents, but did not dissipate. Inside the white mist, there was an enormous shadow. Under the sunlight, one could vaguely see that it was a piece of land. That piece of land was at least the size of an ordinary city in the world. But the white mist was moving, and it was always at the center of the white mist. This meant that this piece of land was also floating. As the strategist of the Qin dynasty whose prestige had surpassed Yuanwu and Zheng Xiu, Lin Zhujiu had seen countless fantastical things in his life. But when he looked at this piece of land, his eyes were still filled with shock and emotion. He could not help but say to Zhang Shiwu next to him, "If I did not see it with my own eyes, who would have thought that the true Jiaodong commandery is a floating piece of land like this, a city that moves with the currents?" Zhang Shiwu grimaced. He was also in a state of indescribable shock. On that floating piece of land, he saw the outlines of some enormous buildings. He could not help but think, no wonder Zheng Xiu, a woman from Jiaodong commandery, had such great ambition when she entered Chongling. He did not speak, but his breathing was heavy. When Lin Zhujiu spoke, he did not use vital energy. His voice was not loud and could not travel far on the surface of the sea. But at this time, on the miraculous floating piece of land in the white mist, a terrifying presence suddenly exploded. As this terrifying presence exploded, hundreds of thousands of whirlpools appeared on the calm surface of the sea. The ship Lin Zhujiu and Zhang Shiwu were on was thrown high into the air by the waves. At the same time, countless fish that had not felt any danger jumped out of the sea in shock. The fish in the deep sea shone with all kinds of colors, like countless gems flying out of the sea and exposed to the sunlight. But in the next moment, they were torn apart by a vast and violent presence, turning into a rain of blood and bone fragments that blew towards Lin Zhujiu and Zhang Shiwu. Zhang Shiwu's expression did not change at all. He just pressed down with his hands and stabilized the ship thrown into the air by the waves. Lin Zhujiu's brow furrowed slightly, and a strange expression appeared on his face. He took a deep breath and was certain he smelled that familiar scent. Then he could not help but shake his head. I had not expected this thing to grow. Zhang Shiwu slowly channeled his vital energy and had the ship retreat along the waves until it left the area covered by the presence. Then he looked at Lin Zhujiu. "I fear we cannot force our way in." Lin Zhujiu naturally saw his meaning. He shook his head and said, "Wait for him to come." Zhang Shiwu's tense shoulders relaxed slightly. He said, "I am just worried that you have soaked in the water for so many years. If you stay on the water now, you will want to vomit. You finally know how to tell a joke." Lin Zhujiu laughed and said, "That is river water, this is sea water. One is light, one is salty. It is refreshing." Chapter 710. Zhang Shiwu grinned. While he could not help but laugh, he felt this was not a joke. No matter who it was, after being imprisoned in a dark water prison for many years, and struggling at death's door while smelling the rotting smell of their own body, they would find it fresh if they smelled something different. He knew that Lin Zhujiu was able to endure such a life because of strong hatred. People could tolerate a certain level of betrayal, but how could they accept the betrayal of the people they spent time with? So many people who could laugh together and go through life and death together had died in such a betrayal. Tianping Commandery was the commandery closest to Nanquan Commandery in the Chu dynasty. At this time, it was the focus of everyone's attention, because the majority of the remnant army of the Chu dynasty was fighting with the Qin army on the plains. Unlike cultivators, the retreat of an army involved more details. Some refugees and wounded soldiers along the way had to be settled down. The armies had to restrain and defend each other. Some defended, some retreated. If there was a problem, it would lead to astounding numbers of deaths and injuries. Cultivators would only need a day and night to pass through a commandery, but large numbers of troops would need several times, or even dozens of times the time to retreat. although it was said to be the remnant army. In reality, after retreating from Yanshan Commandery, the hundreds of thousands of Chu soldiers had split into hundreds of groups. Some had different missions along the way, and some had been scattered by the Qin army. Some Chu soldiers had lost contact with other Chu soldiers. Because they were too far away, they could not even see the smoke signals of the main army retreating to Nanquan Commandery. They relied on their soldiers' instincts to fight on this land. Most of the Chu army had lost their supplies a dozen days ago. Even the horses and beasts were not as tenacious as these soldiers. After a long time of insufficient supplies and arduous travel, most of the horses and beasts had died and were used as food by the army. Many places where the army passed, even the grass was almost gone. This was not because of trampling, but because the grass roots and tree barks were used as food. Because of the heat and humidity, the skin of the soldiers who had fought off a wave of plague not long ago started to fester. Many people's toes were stuck together, and their stomachs were swollen from eating food that was hard to digest. Because of the lack of medicine, many people even died from intestinal obstruction due to being unable to defecate. Yet such a situation was not unique to the Chu army. As they went deeper into the Chu territory, it meant that they were getting further and further away from familiar battlefields. Other than fighting the Chu army, more and more resistance forces were joining along the way. Some came from the voluntary organizations of the villages, some came from the armies coming from afar, some came from the private armies of the powerful families, and even some bandits who were enemies of the court joined the battle. However, this was not the most important thing. As the pursuer, the Qin army did not have a fortress most of the time and could not wait for the enemy to be exhausted. They did not have the advantage of terrain. Furthermore, because the orders from above were getting harsher and harsher, the army was forced to chase faster and faster. In terms of supply, the Qin army had already lost their advantage. They passed through many barren lands that the Chu army had passed through. Even some of the water sources had been poisoned. Along the way, in order to help the Chu army fend off their pursuit, some villagers even burned down their own villages, leaving only a limited amount of food. The rest of the food was given to the Chu army, and these villagers all hid in the forests they were familiar with. At this time, in a village that had been burned to the ground, there were pieces of cloth cut from tents on the ground. There were thousands of these pieces of cloth that filled the empty spaces of the village. Each piece of cloth had a wounded Qin soldier lying on it. There were only a dozen or so doctors wandering among the wounded. However, these doctors didn't have any medicine left on them. The only things they had were some clean cotton cloths and clean water. The uncontrollable groans of pain formed a sea of sorrow and despair. This army was the Tsangnan army, an army under Wei Wujiu's command. At this time, the highest-ranking generals of the army were Zhang Tu and Tian Rong. Zhang Tu was a famous brawny man among Wei Wujiu's subordinates. His body was abnormally tall and sturdy like a giant when he stood. However, right now he was sitting silently under the thickest camphor tree in the village. His body was thin. Even though he wore armor, he gave off the feeling that he was as thin as paper. Even his cheekbones were high because he was too thin. This camphor tree was extremely thick. Most of its branches and leaves had been burned away in the flames, but because it was close to the stream, it was still tenaciously alive. Under the midday sun at the end of summer, those pitch-black branches still gave this general a shade. Zhang Tu held a stone bowl in his hand. The bowl was filled with sticky millet soup. This was the best food this army could have. Twice, he brought the bowl to his mouth, but put it down again. It was not that the food was hard to swallow, but the wails of pain that made him uneasy. Do you still have to carry out orders? Tian Rong saw him put down the stone bowl for the second time, and finally could not help but speak. He came from Chongling and was handsome to begin with. He was considered a pretty man in the army. But in the battle a few days ago, some of his scalp had been cut off by flying swords. At this time, the bandage cloth had purple-black dried blood that covered half of his face. He did not look like a handsome Qin general, but a vicious and desperate bandit leader. Our daily casualties are more than double the Chu armies. If we go forward, I fear that in just a few days, not many of us will be able to stand. Tian Rong took a deep breath. His expression was slightly twisted, but he lowered his voice. We have already left behind 2 batches of wounded, and there is nothing left to lose. I do not fear death, but you should know why we are in such a hurry to chase. We just have to do our best to destroy the Chu army, and not let them enter Jiaodong Commandery. To protect Jiaodong Commandery, sacrificing the lives of so many brothers may be worth it in her view, but I will not accept it. We have done our best, and to these Chu soldiers, they have hope. They will soon be received by the Nanquan commanderies, but our subordinates have no hope. I can accept a military order to die, but I cannot accept a military order that makes them despair because of someone's whispers. In the end, Tian Rong looked up at Zhang Tu and said seriously, if someone has to bear the crime of disobeying a military order, then I will bear it. Zhang Tu suddenly laughed. He laughed so hard his body started to tremble, and the millet soup in his hand fell to the ground. Tian Rong had never seen him react like this, and stilled. How many years have we lived and died together in the border army? Zhang Tu bowed his head slightly. His face was full of shadows, but he had a cold pride. Since I have done my best, do I not dare to disobey orders? I do not believe the others do not dare to disobey orders. Chapter 7:11. A goshawk was flying among the white clouds. On the mountain under the white clouds, the Yuanwu emperor looked up. With a glance, the goshawk's vitality suddenly disappeared. A faint thread of holy light fell to the side of the Yuanwu emperor's tent. A guard silently picked up this goshawk that had just been killed and handed it to the attendant in charge of food and lodging. Soon, the goshawk's meat was minced and turned into broth in the pot. The meat of the goshawk was too old and coarse and not delicious. But the Yuanwu emperor did not usually care about taste. Even more importantly, he would not allow living beings to fly above his head. When the steam mixed with the fragrance of wild vegetables started to rise from the pot, the Yuanwu emperor put down the scrolls in his hand and stood up. He looked down at the surrounding lands. From time to time, attendants would bring in scrolls from all over the place. While this was a desolate border, because of his existence, it seemed to have become the center of the Qin dynasty. The most important thing for a person was to be able to see themselves clearly other than others. From the start of his cultivation to reaching realm 8, he had seen countless powerful cultivators and geniuses. He knew that compared to those geniuses, if there was something special about him, it was that he was focused, serious, and down-to-earth in everything he did. He was like this in cultivation, in using soldiers, and in governing. Do you know? What I despise the most about you is that your talent is too strong. Ruling a country and pacifying the world is originally a very artistic thing. However, because your cultivation is too high, it has become a crude thing that can be decided by purely relying on martial strength. The existence of a person like you is the greatest threat. Even if you led the army to defeat the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, the Qin dynasty has become a dynasty that only knows martial strength. Even more importantly, you're not part of the imperial house. In the end, the fanatical worship of you will not affect the imperial house. How can the imperial house rule? So you have to die. He said these words to his old friend in his mind. Then he had his attendant bring in hot tea and some washed wild fruits. Because he had already sensed that the other half of the exchange, his son Fu Su, was about to arrive. The silence of the wilderness at the foot of the mountain was shattered by the sound of horse hooves. A group of soldiers escorting a carriage came closer and closer to the foot of the mountain. Su Fu also appeared behind him. Looking at Prince Fu Su, who finally appeared in his line of sight, he remained silent. At almost the same time, on the dark side of Wu Mountain, a seemingly ordinary merchant ship was slowly moving along a river that led to the interior of the Qin. However, this ship had many formations that blocked the primal energies of the universe. Naturally, it was to hide the presence of some special powerful cultivators. Of course, it was not an ordinary ship. In a quiet room, a man in a black robe, who had many white bone ornaments hanging on his body, slowly opened his eyes. When he opened his eyes, many of the runes in this quiet room reacted naturally, and a lot of black gas spread out like vines. This black-robed man was Qi Siren, one of the grandmasters with the highest cultivation and prestige in the Qi dynasty. After he opened his eyes, he shook his head. A disdainful smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. Then he naturally stood up and walked out of this quiet room. His actions caused the expressions of several cultivators on the same boat to change. Because the instant he walked out of the cabin and onto the deck, in the river water outside the ship, countless black gas spread out like the tentacles of a giant octopus. Meanwhile, his figure became fainter and fainter, as if he was about to merge into a certain black gas and then disappear. "You are?" A cultivator dressed in yellow robes could not help but ask in shock. "This should be because you have not settled your own family matters. You have caused me to waste so much effort," Qi Siren said coldly. The last thing his body left in this cultivator's eyes was an exploding black flame. When Qi Siren's body disappeared, this yellow-robed cultivator's great shock and confusion only lasted for a few breaths. The sky suddenly brightened, and even drove away the remaining blackness in the river. A bright sword light seemed to pierce the sky and fly down from the sky. It could not even be described as a meteor, because the speed of this sword light was faster than a meteor. There was only one person in the world who could be so fast. The word kill was swallowed by this yellow-robed cultivator's throat. He knew that if he really gave the order to kill Miss Shang in the cabin, then when he gave the order, he would have been killed by Tantai Guanjian. Also, the cultivators in the cabin would not be able to kill Miss Shang in time. Qi Siren had helped them escort Miss Shang. This was a top secret among top secrets. Even the Qin dynasty's military did not know, especially when only the Yuanwu Emperor and the Empress knew the exact transportation route. So Tantai Guanjin's appearance here was just as Qi Siren had said. It could only be that something had happened between the two of them. It was a family matter. It was also at this moment that a strange vibration came from the bottom of the merchant ship. The merchant ship that had been swiftly moving in the river suddenly ran aground. This wasn't an area full of reefs. However, there were countless tombstones of various sizes, carrying a powerful aura of hatred and gloomy coldness. They floated up from the bottom of the water, easily lifting up this merchant ship and stopping it. "Father." Fu Su walked to the end of the mountain path. Looking at the man waiting for him in front of the tent, he bowed deeply. The reunion of father and son was an exciting moment. But inexplicably, after Fu Su shouted these two words, his heart hurt slightly. His body seemed to grow heavier, so heavy he could not stand up. Yuan Wu waited silently for Fu Su to stand up. He waved his hand. Other than him, Su Fu and Fu Su, everyone else on the mountain peak dispersed. The mountain wind blew through the tent, causing it to flutter. Even his calm voice sounded a little empty. "I know you have something to say. Speak." "Father, you cannot accept this Wuji ancestral mountain's elixir of immortality. This is a scheme to drive a wedge between you and Mother." Fu Su used all his strength to finally look up and say to his determined face, "Then what should I do?" Yuan Wu smiled faintly. "Not release Miss Shang and refuse the suggestion? Putting aside the elixir itself, do you want Miss Shang to die? Or do you want yourself to die?" Fu Su was stunned. He opened his mouth slightly and could not speak. Yuan Wu did not speak and just looked silently at him. "He will not kill me." After a long time, Fu Su honestly said the answer to the question itself. "Of course I do not want Miss Shang to die." Yuan Wu laughed again and shook his head. "You have to understand, from the moment you were born in the imperial family, you are not an ordinary person. Ordinary people think about what to eat today and what to wear tomorrow. But the people of the imperial family think about the world and not the life and death of some people." Chapter 712. To put it simply, what you need to consider first is the Qin dynasty. The Yuan Wu Emperor put away his smile and looked at Fu Su. He said slowly and coldly, "For the strength and prosperity of this dynasty, you must give up on many personal feelings. You must understand, even if there is a day when you must kill me to make this dynasty stronger for this dynasty, you must kill me. looking at Fu Su, whose eyes were filled with more pain. He paused and then said in an even slower and stronger tone, "I know that you have been in contact with that person for a long time, and there will naturally be hesitation that you should not have. But as the crown prince, you should think clearly. Even what I did to the Bazin Kendo ground in the past was not betrayal to the imperial house and this dynasty, but my destiny." For some reason, Fu Su was in so much pain that he could not breathe. He looked at his respected father and said in a trembling voice, "So imperial father can sacrifice me, and even kill mother for this dynasty?" Yuan Wu looked up at the flowing clouds in the sky. After a moment of silence, he said, "At least before this, your mother's existence and actions were of great help to the Qin dynasty. Many times we consider the same things. I hope that in the future, she will be like me and do everything for the prosperity of the Qin dynasty." Fu Su did not hear the most direct response, but he had gotten the answer from Yuan Wu's words. Each person had their own reason for existence, and what they thought was right, especially since Yuan Wu was his father, and had become a wise ruler revered by the people of the Qin dynasty. He had achieved things that none of the previous rulers of the Qin dynasty could reach. So he could not speak and did not have the right to argue. Was this really right? If he could not even protect his family and friends and could be sacrificed, then what kind of cold world would the dynasty be under the rule of such a person? However, such a voice kept echoing in his heart. "I do not like this." After an unknown period of time, the pale-faced Fu Su looked up at Yuan Wu and said, "I do not like to become a person like this. I do not wish to see you and mother become enemies. Even if there comes a day when I have to kill you for the sake of the prosperity of the dynasty, I can't sacrifice you in exchange for such a fruit. Therefore, I'm afraid I can't become the crown prince of the Qin dynasty that you hope for." The Yuan Wu emperor's expression remained calm. There was no trace of anger on his face. Instead, his gaze became even gentler. "You've changed a lot and matured a lot. Otherwise, even if you were against it to a certain extent, you wouldn't have had the courage to say such things to me. It takes a long time for a person to grow. I will give you enough time." After saying this, the Yuan Wu emperor closed his eyes in exhaustion. However, his energy suddenly roared like a new world was shaking. A holy light that was thicker than the mountain peak broke through the clouds, as if it was shining down from another world. This holy light surged into Fu Su's body from all directions like a flood, forcing out a strange power from the depths of his body. Yuan Wu's features showed disgust. This golden and holy light finally condensed into a ball of light the size of a fist. And at the center of this ball of light, a milky white, true essence twisted, like a fat silkworm about to spin silk. And within the silkworm's body, a black crystal floated up and down like waves, rippling with an even more heart-palpitating aura of eternity. A light wind blew through the wormwood on the gray eaves. When a letter reached the mistress of the Chongling imperial palace after being sent multiple times, Chongling was once again at night. The withered wormwood moved in the night. There seemed to be gentle water flowing at the edges of the grass in absolute silence. Yet when the mistress of the imperial palace opened the letter and read the contents, the withered wormwood suddenly stiffened, snapped by an inexplicable power, and flew out of the imperial palace. After more than a decade of training, Chongling and the Qin dynasty under Chongling were like extremely efficient seal weapons. They could perfectly carry the cultivator's will, and the actions at each step were swift and effective. The emperor's study and palace had been damaged in the battle when Bailey Sushue and the Nether Dragon descended. But now, they had been completely rebuilt. Other than the feeling of being brand new, there were no signs of battle. However, the courtyard used to reflect starlight could not be rebuilt due to a lack of materials. The spirit spring she often stayed in had completely dried up. It only attracted ordinary spring water and planted some different-colored lotus flowers. There was no feeling of immortal energy. Moonlight shone down from the ceiling of the newly built study. After being strengthened by some gemstones, it shone brightly on her desk and on the letter she was reading. It illuminated her fingers until they were as white as the best porcelain in the world. This letter gathered many of the fastest military reports from the Qin and Chu border and was several hours faster than the warden's office's fastest military report. The things that came from the Jiaodong Commandery's secret network were almost all important matters. But in the end, the rest of the words were naturally ignored and faded in her eyes. Only two pieces of information remained in her eyes for a long time. One was that Wei Wujiu's Tsangnan army had disobeyed orders and stopped chasing the Chu army. Then, most of the other armies in charge of chasing had stopped. This was almost the entire Qin dynasty army going against her will. This way, even if the Qin troops from the nether floats who had traveled night and day from the Chu capital to the Nanquan forts could arrive according to her plan, they could not completely defeat the Nanquan forts and stop the Chu army from breaking through. The hundreds of thousands of Chu soldiers would get a chance to breathe and enter Jiaodong Commandery. The second thing was that the cultivators escorting Miss Shang had been defeated, and Miss Shang had been rescued. Other than Yuan Wu, no one could be sure of Miss Shang's location. The reason for this matter came from the deal between Ding Ning and Yuan Wu. Empress Zheng Xiu slowly looked up. The moonlight shone in front of her. The letter in his hand also shattered like a withered leaf and flew forward. What did he promise you? What did he give you that you would not hesitate to do such a thing? She took a deep breath and looked at her porcelain-like fingers that didn't grab anything. She said slowly and coldly, "Is everything just a deal?" Chapter 713. On the other side of the Chongling Imperial Palace, Huhai woke up from a nightmare. The mattress under him was completely soaked in his cold sweat. In his nightmare, his skin and flesh had melted onto the mattress. The feeling in his dream was very similar to the sticky feeling he was experiencing now. What surprised him was not just the indescribable terror, but also the extremely soft sounds and coldness. The sound was the sound of the grass on the eaves breaking. The coldness came from the starlight moving through the night. This was a scent he was familiar with since childhood. For some reason, he felt from childhood that his mother did not like him. Her preference for Fu Su was not shown on the surface, but her gaze and even her back when she turned caused him to feel this coldness. He could not understand why there was such a terrifying coldness. Even if his cultivation talent was slightly lacking compared to Fu Su, were they not both her sons? Why was there such a difference? Tonight, the coldness was exceptionally clear. After he woke up from the nightmare, he did not dare to move on the sticky bed. These soft sounds were like the hissing of a poisonous snake. He could not help but think of that dark underground where Xin Xian had pierced his skin with hollow needles. The sound of blood spraying out of the needles was like this. This soft sound was especially clear in the absolute silence. The blood turned into red mist and shrouded him. The sound lasted for a long time, but the loss of blood in his body was not great. It would only make people feel weak and helpless. Of course, there was also the accumulation of extreme terror. Huai's body started to convulse. His body convulsed on the sticky mattress, and even jumped. There were muffled sounds on the sturdy mattress, and in the empty imperial palace, it became a heart-shaking noise. Panicked footsteps and shouts sounded. A doctor quickly rushed to his side. This doctor, who was also a powerful cultivator, used his vital energy to send many medicinal liquids that could stop the body from convulsing and calm the soul into Huhai's body. Then the doctor quickly and skillfully took out many golden needles, stabbing them into some of Huhai's meridian points where his energies were surging. This kind of imperial doctor had great skills, but what made his expression ugly was that, just like the previous times, he could not resolve Huhai's symptoms. Huhai's convulsions were like a real nightmare that could not be shaken off. In the next few breaths of time, he had no choice but to slap Huhai's lungs with both hands, using his own energy to maintain the functions of Huhai's internal organs, so that Huhai would not be unable to breathe during the violent convulsions, or even have serious problems with his internal organs. The palpitating sound of his body crashing against the bed continued for a long time. The doctor's clothes were completely soaked. When the situation was completely stabilized, the doctor walked out of Huhai's bedroom. Under the bright moonlight, his face was a bit ashen. He said to his colleagues and disciples who were waiting for him in a line, "We have to find a way to cure him completely, or find someone who can cure him better than us. Otherwise, if this continues, it won't be a psychological problem anymore. His entire body will be completely crippled." In the dark night, the mottled soul-suppressing nail slowly withdrew from Miss Shang's chi. Qian Mu's fingers had a black energy flow connected to this soul-suppressing nail. This scene gave people the feeling that his fingers had melted and connected to this soul-suppressing nail. His cultivation came from his most respected master, Yin Ying. As a result, he took shortcuts in the previous realms and was unable to understand the minute changes in each realm. Therefore, he should stay at Realm 7 for the rest of his life and never be able to break through to Realm 8. But because he had perfectly inherited Yin Ying's life bond item and had powerful methods that other people could not understand, he was almost invincible among Realm 7 Grandmasters. But this soul-suppressing nail was the ultimate treasure of the Qi dynasty. For all cultivators who cultivated Yin and Ghost methods, it was a divine item with extremely powerful energy. So even for him, the process of removing this soul-suppressing nail was much more difficult than fighting multiple Realm 7s at the same time. After Yin Ying's death, Qi Siren should have been one of the strongest cultivators of the Qi dynasty. He should have had the confidence to face an opponent like Yin Tai Guanjin. Even if he could not win, he likely had the ability to protect himself. But he could not survive under the combined efforts of Yin Tai Guanjin and Qian Mu. So when he sensed the presence of Yin Tai Guanjin and Qian Mu, he decisively abandoned Miss Shang and left. He did not even have the time to kill Miss Shang and take away this soul-suppressing nail. The soul-suppressing nail was a holy item used by the Qi imperial family to intimidate the sections. It was an important weapon of the country. So when Qi Siren fled, when he faced Zheng Xiu's subordinates, he appeared so cold and angry. Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiu had problems. This was a family matter of the Qin dynasty. But in this change, the one who had suffered the greatest loss was the Qi dynasty. As time slowly passed, when Qian Mu finally pulled out this soul-suppressing nail, he grew weak and trembled all over. "Many thanks." Miss Shang bowed seriously in thanks. The old servant who had been following her bowed deeply to him. "You can forge this soul-suppressing nail into your life bond item." Qian Mu knew that her life bond item had been destroyed in the battle against Qi Siren, so he immediately suggested. Miss Shang needed such a powerful life bond item, and she knew that Qian Mu did not need such a life bond item. So she did not refuse and took this holy item from Qian Mu's trembling hands. Li Yunrui and Bai Shanshui, the husband and wife, are they really going to rob the 12 shaman gods? She asked worriedly. There was no need to say how powerful Bai Shanshui and Li Yunrui were when they worked together. But the Qi dynasty was the dynasty with the most Realm 7 grandmasters. The ghostly methods of grandmasters like Qi Siren were not something ordinary cultivators could deal with. In her mind, she did not think that just Bai Shanshui and the others could stop the Qi Emperor from using the 12 shamans. Ding Ning says it is possible because we only need to destroy it and not obtain it, Qian Mu said quickly. Qian Mu quickly answered. Also, he said that what he thought clearly, Bai Shanshui would think clearly as well. So Bai Shanshui said to leave this matter to her. Miss Shang stilled. There was a great difference between destruction and obtaining. But for all cultivators who cultivated ghostly methods, they would not think that someone would not want to obtain such a cultivation treasure and be willing to destroy it. Since this is the case, there should be no problem. Miss Shang nodded. Her gaze landed on the two servants next to her and Qian Mu. These two servants were dressed strangely. Their bodies were covered in heavy black robes, and even their faces were covered in black cloth that flowed with black flames. Her cultivation came from the method of the Qi dynasty, so she knew that these two servants were not living people. Your sect has a method to control corpses as servants and prevent their energies from dissipating. She could not help but ask. In her knowledge, even the legendary 12 shamans did not have such a heaven-defying method. Not completely. They need to be nourished by the energies of the 1,000 Grave Mountain. Qianmu looked at her and explained without concealing anything. It was like using life bond energies to maintain these corpses. Miss Shang stilled, because in the end, the life bond items' energies would be used up and eaten by these corpses like food. The Thousand Grave Mountain is the life bond item my master left me. If I can turn it into a stronger method to help my master take revenge, this is worth it. Qianmu could see her confusion and said, even if master's life bond item is not here, I still remember the method he taught me. Even if I cannot reach Realm 8, as long as it is passed down, someone will surpass me in the end. Young Mistress Shang understood what he meant. She thought for a moment, then raised her head and said slowly in her usual gentle voice, since Bai Shan Shui is in charge of that matter, we don't have to interfere. Since you have such thoughts, then let's go to another place in the Qi dynasty. Chapter 714. Go where? Qianmu looked in shock at Miss Shang. There are thousands of tombstones on Thousand Tombstones Mountain. Since you do not hesitate to use the energy of the tombstones your master left you to turn into a more effective weapon for revenge, the more corpses you raise, the stronger they will be. Even if these corpses only have abilities close to Realm 6 cultivators, they are dead and do not fear death when facing enemies. Miss Shang stroked her energy sea and slowly adjusted the energy in her body. She did not answer directly, but asked in return. If the number of corpses you raise reaches a certain level, then you will not only be able to fight against some powerful cultivators, but have the power of a single cultivator against an enormous army. Think about it in the Qi dynasty, where are the corpses of many grandmasters preserved? Qianmu suddenly shook. His breathing paused slightly. Former Sage Hall? Eldest Miss Shang's voice was as gentle as usual, neither fast nor slow. Do you dare to dig it up with me? Qianmu looked at her for a long time and could not help but say, you are not like the ghosts of the fish market. The former Sage Hall was not an ordinary hall, but an imperial tomb, the tomb of the founding emperor of the Qi dynasty. This hall worshipped the statues of the virtuous emperor and the people who had contributed to the founding of the dynasty. It recorded their deeds, and below this hall was their tomb. Those people who were called sages and saints in the history books of the Qi dynasty, no matter if they died on the battlefield or died of old age in the process of ruling the country, or died of illness, were buried together with the great emperor using special methods. 36 sages, 72 saints, and those saints and sages of lower status, in the history books of the Qi dynasty, corresponded to the stars in the sky. The children of the common people had heard the stories of many of these people. Even in the homes of the sages and places where they had cultivated and studied, ancestral halls were built to commemorate them. Back in Yi Zhao's Thousand Dust Mountain formation, Ding Ning and he had thought about the possibility of controlling many corpses to form an army. That way, even if they encountered an army like Bai Qi's god-killing army, they could win. In the Thousand Dust Mountains, Qianmu had controlled many corpses like this. But he was not ambitious enough. He had not connected this to a place like the former Sage Hall. This was not as simple as digging up an imperial tomb. How many cultivation places and families in the Qi dynasty were related to those sages and saints? What would the people of the Qi dynasty think? In the legends, the eldest miss of the Shang family lived in Changling's fish market like a ghost hiding in a temple. She did not even dare to see the sun. But now, Qianmu knew what kind of power was contained in her weak voice. Who doesn't want to have a place to settle down, where there are no conflicts and no worries? If they weren't forced into a desperate situation, who would do something desperate? Miss Shang looked at Qianmu, her gentle voice filled with bitterness. The last daughter of the Shang family is alone and weak. Even if my entire family was executed, I did not dare to talk about revenge. I'll just live the rest of my life in fish market. But Chongling cannot even tolerate fish market. My senior sect brother was pierced through my energy sea by a soul-setting nail, and my life was used to threaten the Bazin Kendo ground. Now, the Qi Emperor does not distinguish friend from foe, and has betrayed us. So what if I dig up his ancestral tomb? I am from the Qin, and have obtained some cultivation methods of the Qi. Even if I am cursed and chased by the Qi for eternity, I do not care. But you You are Yin Ying's disciple. It is up to you if you want to go with me. Qian Mu calmed down in this gentle and bitter voice. My master even sacrificed his life for the Qi. But what did he do? He said softly and calmly, I think that if his ancestor knew of his actions today, if he could jump out of his coffin, he would slap him personally. Digging up the former sage hall to teach him a lesson will let the Qi people think. Why has Zhengxiu never liked Hu Hai, but favored Fu Su? Is it because Fu Su is really her and Wang Jingming's flesh and blood? Fu Su is her and Wang Jingming's flesh and blood. There is almost no such possibility. In my personal judgment, she does not like Hu Hai. One reason is that Hu Hai is stupid. When he was young, he heard about some people from the Bazin Kendo ground. He disliked those people from the Bazin Kendo ground and did not have any respect for them. Maybe he naively thought that by viciously cursing Yuan Wu and her former opponents, he could win her love. But he did not understand her complex emotions. Another reason is that Hu Hai may not be what she needs. Maybe she only needs a son like Fu Su, an imperial son born, because he is not what she needs will not be liked by her after birth. Also, Fu Su looks more like her. Many people think that he looks like Wang Jingming, and Hu Hai looks more like Yuan Wu. So you mean that she actually likes Wang Jingming more? And Hu Hai came from a time she was not willing to sleep with him? No one can say for sure about the love and hate of people like her. As to sleeping with her, that is completely my guess. I feel that for powerful grandmasters, physical pleasure and mental pleasure cannot be compared. Whoever gets who, this is like conquest. People like them, in bed, each has their own needs. No one can say that they have conquered the other. But it is different when it comes to giving birth to children. In Chongling, a man with a thick bandage on his face was having a conversation with the doctor, helping him remove the bandage that would appear disgraceful in Chongling. This man was Zhao Gao. He had originally worn the yellow robes of Jiaodong Commandery, and was the Jiaodong Commandery envoy closest to Zhengxiu. The doctor was Han Yuchen, a famous doctor of the former Han dynasty with the reputation of Jade-Face Ghost Hand. But time was the best butcher's knife. His hair was white at this time, especially after the Han dynasty was destroyed. In the first few years of being enslaved in the Qin dynasty, his vision had been damaged, and even some of his teeth had come loose due to the rough food. So his face appeared older than many people of the same age, and wrinkles had appeared at the corners of his eyes and forehead. Zhao Gao and Han Yuchen were talking in the depths of the medical clinic. The design of the cellar was almost the same as the cellar Shen Xian had imprisoned Hu Hai in, and was also Shen Xian's work. During the long period of time where he had disappeared from the world, Zhao Gao had been subjected to many bone-cutting and face-repairing techniques in this place, where he never saw the light of day. At this moment, the thick bandages covering his face were removed layer by layer. Two identical faces appeared in this dark room. The same white hair, the same face, even the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes and forehead, and the missing teeth were the same. Zhao Gao's appearance, and even his figure, was the same as Han Yuchen's. Han Yuchen looked at Zhao Gao with emotion. It was as if he was looking at a mirror. Cutting and setting bones, especially changing one's height and grinding away some of the different edges and corners of the bones, was an unbearable pain for normal people. This kind of pain would accompany a person for the rest of their life. However, the man in front of him easily endured it. This was the greatest work of his life. Now even the skin color is the same. I have taken care of the scars for you. When you are on the ground and walk under the sun for many days, the medicinal energy will naturally dissipate. Han Yuchen looked at Zhao Gao and said emotionally and seriously, if there is a flaw, it is your cultivation. Zhao Gao laughed. He nodded, and then a soft sound came from his energy sea. In the next moment, his body began to release primordial qi. This kind of release was very violent. It was not the usual quick use of vital energy, but completely dispersing one's cultivation. Han Yuchen's eyes were filled with shock. You destroyed your own cultivation? Zhao Gao pressed his lips together, and then recovered his calm. He smiled again. Since revenge does not require cultivation, then this only flaw does not need to exist. Han Yuchen took a deep breath and said after a moment of silence, this way, It will take a few more days to not expose the fact that you are a cultivator. Also, I have told you everything I know in these days. You should know how to use medicine to help you better." Zhao Gao nodded and bowed deeply to express his gratitude to the doctor. Han Yuchen's expression turned solemn. He bowed seriously in return, and then gently crushed the pill that had been stuck between his teeth. His face quickly turned black. Black blood flowed out of his nostrils. Then he died painlessly, and his body slowly turned into black water. In his and Zhao Gao's plan, there was a final flaw, and that was himself. From now on, he disappeared. Zhao Gao was him, and there was no more flaw. Time seemed to freeze in this dark room. Zhao Gao bowed for a long time and did not stand. Chapter 7:15. In the morning, Zhao Gao appeared in the courtyard of the medical shop. He flipped through some medicines that were being dried. In the past few months, he remembered all the characteristics of these medicines, including how to use them. Han Yuchen had taught him medicine, but he did not have any practical experience. He had to be especially careful and not make any mistakes. "Teacher," a student appeared not far behind him. After bowing, he said with difficulty, "The people from the Imperial Palace have come to invite teacher again. If you do not agree, I fear it will be difficult. Tell them that I need to prepare some medicines. In 5 days, I will enter the palace with them." Zhao Gao said slowly and softly, "Tell them not to be nervous. I have my own ideas." "Okay, I'll go tell them now." Hearing his answer, the student standing respectfully immediately let out a sigh of relief, and immediately turned around and hurried out. Zhao Gao reached out to touch the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. He knew that even this student who had been closest to Han Yuchen in the past did not feel anything unusual. Then in the future, no one would suspect his identity. In the morning, in the imperial palace of the Qi dynasty, the Qi emperor drank a bowl of bird's nest and a bowl of ginseng soup. Then he rubbed his eyes and stopped looking at the mountain of documents on the table. In this war, his identity was Zheng Xiu's ally. In reality, what the border army generals did not know was that a secret Qi army had been heading towards the Chu heartland in the past few days in order to cooperate with Zheng Xiu in killing the remnants of the Chu army at the Nanquan commanderies. If nothing went wrong, then the Nanquan commanderies would become an enormous battlefield like Yangshan commandery. Also, the killing there would be crueler than Yangshan commandery because the Chu army would not have a place to flee, and their corpses would be thrown there. In the past days, the Qin army had shown unusual determination and pursued the Chu army at all costs. This gave him great confidence. But as the latest military intelligence came, he had not expected that the problem would appear on the side of the Qin dynasty. Many of the pursuing Qin soldiers stopped in their tracks. Naturally, this was due to some generals disobeying orders out of sympathy for their subordinates. But as the news that Qi Serene and the others sent back reached the imperial palace, he could judge that some of it was because of Yuan Wu. In reality, this matter was very simple. While most of the armies and cultivators of the Qin dynasty were under Zheng Xiu's control, these armies and cultivators were loyal to Yuan Wu. But Yuan Wu did not command them directly. So when Yuan Wu expressed a different opinion, this battle would be completely taken over by Yuan Wu. If the main force of the Qin army did not come, then the Qi army that he had spent a lot of effort to arrange would also lose its effect. Even more importantly, the person he had worked with before was Zheng Xiu. Now that Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiu were not on the side, many of his connections with the Qin dynasty were cut off. When Ding Ning officially appeared in the Nanquan commanderies as the leader of the Bazin Kendo ground, there were more and more voices opposing him in the dynasty, especially when there was a problem between Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiu. Jiaodong commandery must have fallen into the hands of the Chu and Bazin Kendo ground. This kind of voice could not be suppressed. He had not slept for many days, but he was certain that after today, this kind of opposition would completely disappear. Because today would be a grand ceremony that would forever be recorded in the history of the Qi dynasty. It was the day that the powerful methods of the 12 shamans would return to the Qi dynasty. He started to bathe and change his clothes. The true reason he had to come in person was not because he needed to appear in the history books, but because the power to protect the 12 shamans could not be scattered. All of the powerful cultivators in the palace protecting him would follow him to where the 12 beast gods were, and then wait for the young geniuses he had chosen to be absolutely loyal to him to come into contact with the 12 shamans and comprehend and cultivate the strongest methods on them. That would be the most heavily guarded place in the Qi dynasty. A group of cultivators would be born there that could change the world in the future. The passions and feelings inside would change a person's appearance. When he appeared in front of the waiting officials, he gave off unprecedented light. When the light in his eyes fell into the eyes of the officials, they were like flickering torches. The experts in the depths of the palace came out in full force, and then escorted him and the officials to the river. The river water was slightly red, and the water roared. 3 enormous metal ships floated out of the water with a dark presence. These were 3 nether floats, one of the gifts Zheng Xiu had given him. Under the control of the Qi cultivators who had mastered the formations on them, the 3 nether floats moved quickly. In just half a day, they passed through the endless green mountains. When the sun was strong at noon, the 3 nether floats entered a gate. The river behind the gate led straight to a mountain. There were cliffs on both sides of the river. To be more precise, there was a ring-shaped mountain that surrounded the mountain directly opposite the river. The river was a passageway that was forcibly opened up in the ring-shaped mountain outside. The mountain was not large, just 100 feet tall, but the trees on it were enormous. Some of the trees had grown for countless years and gave people the feeling that they were as tall as the mountain. Most awe-inspiring was that the sunlight could not reach the mountain. The bright light rays were all blocked by a strange force outside the mountain. Just a few feet away from the mountain, these rejected bright light rays condensed into clusters of faintly discernible golden flame. The mountain that no light entered was pitch black. The outside of the mountain was covered in golden flames, but the inside of the mountain was like an eternal night. This kind of scene would only appear in some storybooks describing the dwellings of gods and demons. In the pitch-black mountain, there was a wide staircase facing the river that was as wide as the river. The staircase stopped halfway up the mountain, at the end of which was a very ancient temple. This was the ancestral hall of the Qi dynasty. It was also the ancestral hall of the Jin dynasty that had once ruled this part of the Qi dynasty. Because the cultivation place and the cultivation method were of the same origin, all the cultivators who cultivated the Yin and Ghost methods in this region came from the same ancestral master. There had been a time when only those cultivators who took in the spirit energy of the universe were considered orthodox. Cultivators who cultivated the Yin and Ghost methods were almost all killed and thought of as the extreme evil path. However, there was a cultivator who cultivated the Yin God Ghost method that survived that era and used his nearly invincible cultivation to render others helpless. In the end, people had no choice but to acknowledge the status of cultivators who cultivated the Yin God Ghost method. This ancestral hall and the 12 shamans came from that ancestral master. The 12 shamans were the most important 12 scriptures of the ancestral hall and recorded the most important things. Only when the 12 shamans returned to the bodies of the 12 shamans would the powerful methods be complete. Chapter 716. The 12 sorcerer deities represented the 12 most powerful techniques of the Grandmaster in the past. He once had 12 disciples who respectively cultivated these 12 techniques to the extreme. However, it was because of a split among the 12 disciples that the heads of the 12 sorcerer deities were separated from their bodies and left to wander about in the outside world. The authenticity of the heads of the 12 shamans had been verified. After they were placed back on the bodies of the 12 shamans, the true meanings of the powerful moves that had been lost would appear on the surface of the bodies of the shamans. Yet the formation of the entire ancestral hall was one. The placement of the heads of the 12 shamans needed the formation to adjust accordingly. Otherwise, the stimulation of energy would cause the heads of the 12 shamans to crumble to dust and disappear from the world forever. The adjustment of the formation meant that some openings that could be infiltrated would temporarily appear in the ancestral hall. But this was not what the Qi Emperor was worried about the most. The passageway leading to the 12 shamans in the ancestral hall was filled with unusually thick yin energy. Only those chi cultivators who cultivated methods related to the ancestral hall would not be harmed. If ordinary cultivators entered, their energies would be corroded. Even the powerful Realm 7 Grandmasters would weaken their vital energy if they stayed inside for too long. They would also be unable to absorb the primal energies of the universe from the outside. Their methods would be no different from those of low-level cultivators. This time, the young cultivators he chose for the Witch God's Return ceremony all came from sects related to this ancestral hall. Even if it was just the methods of some disciples, at least they would not be damaged by the yin energy inside. If they were really harmed, then this meant that this young person did not qualify to cultivate the methods of the 12 shamans. He would not care about such injuries and deaths. What he was most worried about was that some grandmasters in the dynasty would not accept this arrangement and steal the methods of the 12 shamans. So up until now, he had only conducted this event in the name of the ancestral hall and had not announced the news of the 12 shamans. He had to wait until the 12 shamans were placed back in place, and the formation of the ancestral hall was adjusted. The formation was as perfect as it was now, enough to stop those chi grandmasters from entering the ancestral hall. Only then would he be at ease to announce to the world. Everything had been carefully calculated. There was only half a day left. Night was the best time for cultivators to cultivate yin energy. Whether it was in the Jin dynasty or the current Qi dynasty, important ceremonies were held at night. When night fell, the formation in the ancestral hall would be adjusted, and the 12 shamans would return to their positions. 2 nether floats would also arrive. The 2 nether floats carried the cultivators that the Qi dynasty had sent to the Chu capital. These experts were all loyal supporters of Emperor Qi. Their return would make the ceremony safer. There were many grandmasters among these cultivators. Their collective return was one of the important reasons why the Qi army could not stop the remnants of the Chu army. Waiting was torturous for anyone. However, as time passed, the golden flames outside the mountain began to sway, and the eternal night inside the mountain began to sway. The black energy flowing out of the ancestral hall began to form ever-changing totems in the air. Everyone present began to breathe erratically. The cultivators started to confirm that something in the ancestral hall was changing. Today's ceremony was not as simple as reminding everyone who cultivated yin energy that they were of the same origin. Many grandmasters of enough status sent people to the Qi emperor. Their meaning contained a dangerous threat. While they did not know what the Qi emperor wanted to do, regardless of what he wanted to do, he could not cause any damage to the ancestral hall. "I will not allow anyone to damage the ancestral hall," the Qi emperor replied. The Qi emperor replied, and then maintained his silence, until the last ray of sunlight disappeared from the horizon, and the dancing golden flames outside the mountain suddenly turned black and fiercely rose up. It was as if the shadows of all the giant trees in the mountain had left the ground and were instead projected into the sky. He announced, "Only the 12 shamans have returned here." Countless cries of surprise and loud booms caused by the surging of vital energy struck the water. Many grandmasters could not control the vibrations of their vital energy. The leaked vital energy and the primal energies of the universe gathered and formed enormous demonic shadows in the sky that swayed. At the same time, the water in the river started to tremble and create waves. The 2 nether floats had arrived on time, passing through the river like moving mountains. The Qi emperor raised his head to look at the swaying black, demonic shadows in the sky, as though they were about to pierce through the heavens. With an indescribable joy and pride, he repeated, "The 12 shamans have returned today." His voice was not loud among the gasps and vibrations of energy, but when his voice sounded again, it was not just the 2 nether floats that came later that rumbled. Dozens of enormous figures charged out. The grandmasters who could not control their emotions before did not restrain themselves. They looked up at the sky and released their presence even more recklessly. The sky roared again. The gigantic black, demonic shadow grew even larger, jumping and colliding endlessly. It was as if countless giant devils were roaring, as if they were unbridled revelry and venting. Seeing such an unbridled venting, the Qi Emperor pressed his lips together and did not speak. But inside, he was certain that what he did was correct. Unlike the cultivators of other dynasties, the cultivators of the Qi dynasty were always in a repressed state. Because in the past many years, even if the cultivators outside feared the cultivators of the Qi dynasty, they only feared the word eerie. All the cultivators of the Qi dynasty wanted to regain the glory of the past. For a grand ceremony, the resonance of countless grandmasters was the best movement. Hundreds of young Qi cultivators walked out of the cabins behind the Qi Emperor and received the baptism of this movement. They finally understood what the harsh selection and competition had been for. Looking at the figure of the Emperor in front of them, who had different reputations, they trembled with excitement and bowed to pay their respects. It was also at this moment that a black wind blew out from the mountain ahead. The formation of the ancestral hall was completely adjusted at this moment. This black wind did not appear cold at all. The water on the river did not even form mist, much less frost. But when this black wind blew past the crowd, it immediately froze the blood of dozens of palace attendants and hundreds of guards. These palace attendants and guards turned into black ice sculptures and were scattered among the other palace attendants and guards. These palace attendants and guards did not cultivate energy methods. The palace attendants and guards around them who had cultivated energy methods felt their blood flow faster than usual, and their hearts beat faster. Chapter 7:17. As the blood gushed to their heads in waves, the faces of these palace maids and guards were strangely bright red, but their sea of consciousness was exceptionally clear. The energy in their bodies seemed to be unprecedentedly vigorous. Looking at their companions who had frozen to death in the wind and turned into black ice sculptures, these palace attendants and guards even had a wondrous and terrifying feeling as though the vitality of those people had transferred to their bodies. Terror and awe were born from the same source. But to most of the nobles and cultivators present, the lives of these palace attendants and guards were like sacrifices. They just made the ceremony more solemn and grand. This kind of nether wind was a method the sect used to defend against the foreign races. In the past, the cultivators who cultivated the methods of ghosts and energy were persecuted more severely, and their methods of defense were crueler. At the tail end of the 100 or so young cultivators who were walking along the river surface towards the Black Mountain, there was a young cultivator who seemed rather unconventional. It wasn't just his clothes that were completely different from those young cultivators, appearing much more luxurious and bright. Most importantly, even though he didn't freeze up like those palace maids and guards, his complexion became frosty white, his body also starting to shiver. This young person was very famous recently. He was Su Qin. He had just arrived on a ship with the Qi cultivators who had returned from the Chu capital. Because of his special status in the Chu capital, even the people around the Qi Emperor easily recognized him. Holy One, why did you allow him to enter the ancestral halls? A black-robed old man who had been standing respectfully in the Qi Emperor's shadow frowned and asked. This old man's beard was very long, reaching his waist. He was the previous sect master of the celestial capital sect, He Miejing. After Yin Ying's death, he, like Qi Siren, was recognized as one of the strongest cultivators in the Qi dynasty. Also, because he had entered the palace to serve the Qi Emperor, he had given up the position of sect master of the celestial capital sect to protect the Qi Emperor. In the world of cultivators and in the court, he had extraordinary status. Among the hundreds of young cultivators, 5 of them came from the celestial capital sect. For a ceremony like this proportion was a great honor for a sect. But he still could not tolerate a Qin person, an outsider, entering the ancestral hall to study. The relationship between the Qi Emperor and He Miejing was not very different from the relationship between Yuanwu and Shufu. So he had no need to conceal anything. He did not turn his head. His lips moved slightly as he said softly, "Some problems have occurred between Zheng Xiu and Yuanwu. Their opinions are no longer the same." But Yuan Wu cannot completely suppress Zheng Xiu in the short term, or eliminate Zheng Xiu. For a long time in the future, Su Qin will still be the true ruler of the Qin dynasty in the Chu, and may be the only channel between us and Zheng Xiu. He is very important to us. After a pause, the Qi emperor said coolly, "The reason I agreed to let him enter the ancestral hall is because he does not cultivate a Yin energy method related to it. Even with the help of some medicines and seal weapons, he cannot stay for long inside and learn anything." He Miejing looked at Su Qin's trembling back, nodded, and did not speak. In the eyes of a hunter, no matter how strong a beast was, it was just prey. But at this time, Emperor Qi and He Miejing did not notice that the closer they got to the Black Mountain, the more obvious the mocking smile on Su Qin's lips became. At this moment, there was no more chilly wind blowing out. It was obvious that the formation had been completely adjusted. That strange defensive power had completely covered the entire mountain. Only right in front of them, there was an opening at the stairs leading up the mountain. The edges of the opening that could accommodate 2 or 3 people flashed with a strange light. It was like a blade was plated with a special kind of gold, and gave people the feeling that a crack like this had appeared in the void. This mountain protection formation would only be effective for a short period of time. It would only be possible for people to sneak in for a few dozen breaths when the 12 shamans were placed back in place. But Su Qin believed that this would not be a problem for Bai Shanshui. From a certain point of view, Bai Shanshui, who dared to sing and fight in Chongling and resist the Netherfloat fleet when the Chu capital fell, was not just too arrogant, she was like a true madwoman at times. These Qi grandmasters, even if their cultivation was not much different from madmen like Bai Shanshui and Zhao Si, but in Su Qin's view, these grandmasters were not good enough to be on the stage. They were fundamentally different. This was because only people who were crazy enough could do crazy things. Invincible existences of any era were worthy of respect. Both the Yu emperor of the former Yu dynasty and this grandmaster, whose Yin energy and ghost methods became mainstream in the cultivation world. Even for a schemer like Su Qin, when he stepped on the stone steps of the mountain, the disdain at the corners of his mouth disappeared and his eyes narrowed slightly. The stone steps were dry, without any moisture, but the moss grew vigorously in the cracks of the stone steps. These moss and the trees that were as tall as the mountain were unable to see sunlight, but they absorbed another kind of energy from the mountain. Over time, they turned into a kind of inky black crystal. Many trees would turn to stone after being buried in the earth, and even turn into jade. But that was the process after death. All the trees, flowers, and even moss on this mountain were different. Even if they had turned into a kind of black crystal, they were still alive and growing. This was a great method to live from death. In Su Qin's view, just looking at the vegetation on this mountain was enough to change many cultivators' views of the Yin energy and ghost methods. In front of him, the young cultivators selected from the entire Qi dynasty were breathing heavier. Their bodies became lighter and more energetic. They even gave people a feeling of extreme fanaticism amidst their calmness and nervousness. But Su Qin sensed that the stone steps and the vegetation on the 2 sides started to give off a kind of hostility towards him. Some clear black lines appeared around him and approached the surface of his skin. Su Qin breathed slowly. His right hand that was not crippled gripped a stone seal in his sleeve. Under the infusion of his true essence, this stone talisman also emitted a cold and gloomy aura, which slowly spread around his body. The black threads that appeared around his body were like steel needles piercing into the gloomy aura that surrounded his body. They did not dissipate, but became exceptionally slow, and their advance was abnormally slow. Chapter 718. From a certain point of view, the reason he looked down on most of the Qi grandmasters outside was because he was a madman himself. The 12 shamans had been given to the Qi emperor by Zheng Xiu as one of the conditions. While Su Qin had the Qi emperor's permission to enter the ancestral hall, and was Zheng Xiu's envoy that the Qi emperor valued, this did not mean that the Qi emperor cared much about his life. The formations of the ancestral hall came from the hands of that ancestral master. Cultivators who did not cultivate energy methods were definitely foreigners here. Any of the restrictions here only had cold killing intent towards foreigners. Also, the formations here had undergone the baptism of time. Even the guards could not predict what subtle changes had occurred inside. Su Qin could be easily killed by the formations here without any warning. However, this kind of potential threat was nothing to a lunatic. Su Qin walked at the back of the group. When he reached the end of the stone steps and reached the gates of the ancestral hall, the stone seal in his right hand had cracks. The power of the stone seal had been used up. His expression didn't change at all. His left hand released a few strands of true essence, wrapping around another similar stone talisman. He had 10 of these black stone seals on him. Before these stone seals were used up, he had to leave this place. The ancestral hall looked small in the river outside the mountain, but when Su Qin stood in front of it, his eyes unconsciously narrowed into slits. The ancestral hall he saw from outside the mountain was just the gates to the ancestral hall. The gates to the ancestral hall were halfway up the mountain. The half of the mountain was the ancestral hall. In front of the black gates, dozens of feet tall, especially when the black gates had turned into a deep demonic crystal after being soaked in energy for a long time, any life would appear as insignificant as an ant. The energy that was everywhere grew stronger at the gates of the ancestral hall. Those black threads that seemed to grow in the air around his body became even more active. Even though their progress towards his body was still slow to the point of almost stopping, outside of the dark and cold aura that wrapped around him, these black threads began to wildly and chaotically dance. The yin qi that was everywhere was like a great tonic to the 100 young geniuses that walked in front of him. The closer they got to the entrance of the ancestral hall, the smoother and faster the flow of the vital blood in their bodies became, and the higher their spirits became. It was even to the extent that their true essence had unknowingly become stronger. They wanted to see the inheritance of the 12 shamans as soon as possible, so they walked quickly. When the young cultivators at the front stepped into the ancestral hall, their fanaticism reached a peak. Their energies charged at their heads, and great roars sounded in their minds. Some people simply fainted, and some people began to fall into confusion, dancing and laughing. The orderly procession became chaotic, but no one paid attention to the people who had lost control. The young cultivators who were not overwhelmed by the fanaticism first sensed their vital energy inexplicably growing stronger, and in the next breath, the roars in their minds disappeared. This was a very natural process of survival of the fittest. Since so many people entered the ancestral hall to cultivate together, they were very clear about this. When he really passed through the door and stepped into the ancestral hall, Su Qin's footsteps became heavier. He was also affected strangely. The energy coming out of the stone seal in his hand was still protecting his presence so that he would not attract the killing intent of the ancestral hall's formation. But his vital energy was flowing twice as fast as outside. Just like what he knew before, his perception could not go more than 100 feet, and he could not communicate with the primal energies of the universe outside. He furrowed his brows and immediately sped up, overtaking many people in front of him. The ancestral hall was where that invincible cultivator received the worship of his disciples and passed down cultivation records. So the structure inside was not complicated. After the hall where the disciples came to worship, there was a straight passageway. The end of the passageway should be at the center of the mountain. There were almost 20 caves of various sizes. 12 of them were where the 12 shamans were, and where the ancestral master's most powerful library was. The other caves were the formation hubs of this mountain, squarish, straight, and upright. This was the presence of a king, and very similar to the roads and layout of Chongling. But walking in this wide and flat passageway, Su Qin could not help but be shocked. There were all kinds of plants in the passageway. These plants grew from the cracks between the stone walls and the ground. They did not need sunlight at all. All they needed was the yin qi in the hall. Then they grew extremely vigorous and thick. Among them, there were even black, jade-like fruits. He carefully passed through and did not touch any of the plants here. In the process of approaching the 12 shamans, he used up 3 more stone seals. If reaching the 12 shamans required 5 stone seals, Then he could only take a quick look at the 12 shamans before he had to leave immediately. However, reality proved that these ancient stone talismans were indeed effective. Nothing unexpected happened before he reached the 12 shaman shrine. Now it was his time. Su Qin's expression became absolutely calm, and his footsteps slowed down. His left hand flowed with vital energy as he controlled the sixth stone seal. His right hand silently gripped something else. This was a piece of black crystal. The texture of the crystal was very similar to the giant trees that had grown for countless years outside, but it was more transparent. This crystal was only the size of an ordinary person's thumb and was shaped like a hexagonal cylinder. Yet the surface of this crystal was covered in complex seal scripts. The seal scripts were very similar to the seal scripts on the side hall door of the 12 shamans. The fastest group of young cultivators from the Qi dynasty numbered about 20. At this time, they had entered the 12 shamans' temple. What shocked them even more and made them kneel before the statues. The yin energy accumulated within the statues was so dense that it was unimaginable. However, golden flames danced around the statues with extremely dense yin energy. These golden flames had terrifying temperature and were burning. Clearly, they were the condensation of the sun's true fire. These golden flames flowed around the complete sorcerer god statue. As they danced, they naturally formed ancient golden words and pictures. A place of extreme yin giving birth to extreme yang fire. This was a profound change that could not be described with words. It was an extreme transformation. Just this point alone was enough for these young cultivators of the Qi dynasty to be certain that if they obtained the orthodox method of this ancestral master, they would not fear the true fire of the Zhao sword furnace and would not be restrained. Just as these young cultivators were shocked by this scene, Su Qin's fingers started to heat up. The black crystal in his right hand began to heat up rapidly, and the crystal began to turn red. Chapter 719. This piece of black crystal went from slightly hot to completely red in the span of a breath. At this time, the young cultivators who had entered the halls of the 12 shamans, or had approached the halls with him but had not yet entered, had powerful energy vibrations on their bodies, so no one discovered his abnormality. Yet just like the turbulence when the 12 shamans returned, the piece of crystal in his right hand caused the formation deep in the ancestral hall to tremble. Or rather, some of the arrangements buried deep in the ancestral hall's formation core sensed the presence of this piece of crystal and started to wake up. Panting sounds could be heard coming from the depths of the mountain. In a formation core hall behind the 12 shamans, there was a black crystal disk dozens of feet wide at the center. Below the pure and transparent black crystal disk was an unfathomable cylindrical hole. Inside, one could see countless extremely complex crystal formations with the naked eye. Crystals of different shapes were either floating or grinding together like gears. Many profound black lines of light passed through these crystals and flowed endlessly. Above the black crystal disk, there were 7 old people sitting in positions that corresponded to the Big Dipper in the sky. In many legends of the Qi dynasty, the 7 stars of the Big Dipper were the stars of death. The true reason was that the star energy brought by the starlight of that star region could greatly affect the energy of yin and ghosts when it landed in the human world. These 7 old men, be it their black robes or the skin on their faces, had been dyed black by the Yuan Qi in the ancestral hall. They had stayed in the ancestral hall for nearly 100 years, and were the guardians of the ancestral hall that had been passed down for generations. The guardians of the hall had been strictly selected. What they cultivated was how to maintain and control the ancestral hall's formations. When they started to learn this knowledge, they would never leave the ancestral hall for the rest of their lives to ensure that the secrets of the ancestral hall's formations would not be spread outside. From a certain point of view, they were not just the guardians and maintainers of the ancestral hall, but also a kind of symbol of the spirit. When the core of the formation beneath them began to move, the 7 old men opened their eyes at the same time. They were shocked, and even a little shocked as they searched for the source of the movement. In an instant, dozens of flames spread out from their bodies. These flames were all black, but they transformed into all kinds of different shapes. Some were like snakes, some were like flames, and some were like wandering ghosts. These black flames either began to follow the walls of the cavern into other caverns, or they began to penetrate deep into the bottom of the crystal disk, or into the depths of certain ruins. Their spiritual senses searched through many key formation hubs, but they still could not find the source of the problem. They were only certain that this was not a natural ripple like when the 12 shamans returned. How could this be? The old man in the lead cried out in disbelief. Deep below the crystal plate he was sitting on, among the many black crystals, there was a crystal that was carved in the shape of a baby. The black crystal baby stretched out a finger, occasionally releasing wisps of black energy to touch different crystals around it. This black crystal infant was one of the most important nodes of the ancestral hall's formation. But at this time, he saw a thread of golden energy flow out of the black crystal infant's fingertips. In the next moment, there was a boom as a tremendous force surged up from below. A faint golden energy surged up from the black crystal plate they were sitting on, lifting them all up. At the same time, countless golden threads swam through the formation seal scripts they were familiar with. Waves of the same enormous power were constantly activated, forming many invisible barriers. These invisible barriers that could be easily sensed with spiritual senses were originally the protective formations of these halls. But now, as they were activated, even their core hall was locked up, and even the 7 hall guards were trapped in this hall. Boom! 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 Many heavy sounds came from the 12 shaman temples along the passageway. These were the sounds of many young cultivators colliding with these invisible barriers, and then being easily rebounded, smashing into the walls or the ground. The young cultivators who had already entered the 12 sorcerer god temples were isolated inside, while those who had yet to enter were completely blocked outside. The faces of the 7 palace guards turned ashen. They stretched out their hands to touch the crystal plates beneath them, or touch the invisible barriers with their hands. Their bodies were constantly trembling. They finally understood why the 12 shaman temples had been stolen from here in the past. It was not just because the Grand Master had died, and the disciples started to fight each other, but because there were problems between the builders of this ancestral hall. Among the disciples who built this formation for the Grand Master, there was someone who harbored evil intentions. When he was setting up this formation, he had already hidden a secret key that was superior to the control of the formation that they now possessed. But now, someone had activated the formation nodes they did not know about. The sounds of bones breaking, painful wails, and terrified screams filled the passageway after the heavy collisions. When some young cultivators encountered resistance, the vital essence in their bodies naturally reacted and fought back. However, the more power they sent out, the greater the backlash they received. Therefore, some of the young cultivators were directly turned into a bloody mess, lifeless. Blood splattered everywhere outside the 12 shaman god palace. In this great chaos, no one noticed that Su Qin was not obstructed by this invisible barrier. Amidst the muffled sounds of collisions and the flying waves of energy, he was like a fish swimming through a curtain of water, silently entering one of the 12 halls of shamans. The stone seal and formation eye pestle in his hand came from Zheng Xiao. Back then, one of the splitters of the ancestral hall had done something when setting up the formation, and set up a secret formation that was above all the other formation nodes. But after stealing the 12 shaman temples and cutting off this important inheritance, he was naturally hunted down by all the cultivators who cultivated Yin and ghost energies. This splitter fled overseas, and Jiaodong Commandery spent countless years to finally get these things. Many things from Jiaodong Commandery had passed to Zheng Xiao, but these were undoubtedly the most important. Naturally, Zheng Xiao had a deeper motive for handing it over to him. The schemes she used were often to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, and she had a series of follow-up moves. She used the 12 shaman temples to exchange for the Qi Emperor's alliance. Now, she wanted to have Su Qin record some of the methods back to the Qin after the 12 shaman temples returned. After all, Only when the heads of the 12 shaman gods returned to the shaman gods would the complete technique be revealed. In order for Su Qin to record the cultivation method, she had already made other arrangements in advance. But the only thing she had not thought of was that all the knowledge she knew about the ancestral hall came from Jiaodong Commandery. But in one of the archives of the Chu dynasty, there were some records of this ancestral hall. The history of the Chu dynasty was longer than Jiaodong Commandery and the Qin dynasty. Chapter 720. Any library had complete defenses against water and fire. So even though the fire had swept through the entire Chu palace, most of the scrolls in the library had survived. Most of the scrolls did not record cultivation methods, but the experiences and knowledge of many cultivators. Few people would have the patience to read the vast sea of notes and travel notes, even the Chu imperial family, who could enter the libraries at any time. But Su Qin was different. He was just a cultivator from White Goat Cave. For someone like him, any chance was a chance for him to advance in the world of cultivators. Good opportunities would only come to those who worked hard enough. The key was that you were lucky enough. And Su Qin happened to be one of the very few lucky people. In this library that was neglected, he found records about the 12 shamans. Jiaodong Commandery knew the secrets of this formation and the formation I pestle, and the library of the Chu dynasty recorded some secrets about these methods. At the beginning of the Chu dynasty, the first group of cultivators came from the divided Jin dynasty. Some of these people had studied the methods of the 12 shamans in detail and described some of the methods in detail. They even suggested that people who did not cultivate yin energy and ghosts could cultivate some of the methods. So Su Qin's understanding of this ancestral hall and inheritance was greater than any cultivator in the world right now. In fact, just like Ding Ning, what he knew was actually strength, even if his cultivation was temporarily low. Especially after using many methods to confirm that the guardians of the ancestral hall had only taken over this place many years after the Great Change had ended, after the Qi dynasty had truly established itself. They had passed it down from generation to generation. They were certain that neither the Qi emperor nor the guardians knew of the loophole in the formation here, nor the existence of the formation I pestle. Su Qin was even more certain that his true chance had come. Previously, he had followed Li Lingjun back to the Chu, entered Celestial Seal Sect to cultivate because of Zheng Xiu's appreciation, and led the Netherfloat fleet to attack the Chu capital, and became Zheng Xiu's envoy in the Chu. Almost all of these were passive, with Zheng Xiu's shadow standing behind him. However, this was the first time he had taken the initiative to control his own fate. According to Zheng Xiu's order, he had to check the 12 Sorcerer God shrines as soon as possible and find the Sorcerer God that was useful to her. From the techniques of the 12 strongest disciples of the Ancestral Master, she deduced that among the 12 Sorcerer God temples, there was one Sorcerer God whose cultivation method was related to starfire. He could use the cold star fire to resonate with Yin Qi. If she could comprehend this technique, she would definitely become even more powerful. According to her order, after Su Qin recorded the runes and diagrams of the Supreme Sorcerer, he had to try to modify some of the runes on the Supreme Sorcerer with the help of the array I pestle. If he couldn't, he had to try to destroy some of the diagrams and runes. This was definitely because she was worried that someone would be able to discover the secrets of her starfire cultivation method from these runes and diagrams. This was because there were some powerful cultivators who could also use this technique to reverse engineer and probe the mysteries of the starfire origin Qi. The reason Su Qin had the ability to do this was because he had cultivated for a long time in Celestial Seal Sect and had made good achievements. He had a high level of knowledge of seal scripts. Su Qin was even certain that he was arranged to go to Celestial Seal Sect and take over the affairs of the Chu. From the start, it was related to Zheng Xiu's scheme. In his view, the mistress of Chongling was even more terrifying than the rumors. Her plans were deeper, and she would always have a backup plan. But at least, no one could win against the will of the heavens and luck. According to Zheng Xiu's calculations, Su Qin's time after entering the Ancestral Hall was extremely tight. He had to determine which of the 12 Sorcerer God temples she needed as soon as possible. Then, after trying to record the cultivation method on it, he would try to destroy or change the runes on it. Yet she had not expected that when Su Qin knew the methods of the 12 sorcerer god temples before he came here, he had a large amount of time. It was a lot more than she had planned. This time belonged to the present Su Qin. The statue of the sorcerer god that Zheng Xiu needed was ranked 7th among the 12 sorcerer gods. The method recorded on it was the nether fire scripture. When the extinguished star fire and Yin energy merged, the new energy produced could not just erode the energy of other cultivators, but even more terrifying was that it could hide from the senses of other cultivators. Yet the first place Su Qin entered was not the 7th hall. He first entered the 9th hall. While he was the cultivator who knew the most about the 12 sorcerer gods, he had never seen the true appearances of the 12 sorcerer gods before they were sent here, much less the statue of the sorcerer god. When he easily passed through the invisible power of the palace protection formation and entered the 9th hall, when he looked up and saw the statue of the sorcerer god, he could not help but be shocked. This was a completely green statue of the sorcerer god. The statue of the sorcerer god was more than 100 feet tall. It was completely green and translucent, as though it was carved from a green gemstone. But what shocked him the most was not the rare material itself, but the flow of energy inside and outside the statue. Dark red mist flowed out of the 7 orifices of the sorcerer goddess statue. The mist was like a viscous blood mist. The body of the sorcerer goddess statue was like a real person's body. There were countless meridians, and the dark red mist flowed through those meridians. The sorcerer goddess statue was breathing like a real cultivator. Every time he breathed, Yin Qi would be absorbed into his body. It felt as if the sorcerer god statue was cultivating on its own, and his cultivation was slowly increasing. When the crimson, viscous blood mist flowed around the sorcerer god statue, it suddenly scattered and turned into countless flowing lights. Streaks of extremely thin red light flashed across the surface of the green sorcerer god statue, forming runes and diagrams. These runes and diagrams naturally glowed with 7 colors. Behind the sorcerer god statue, which was sitting with its head lowered and its hands caressing its sea of qi, these 7 colors condensed into the phantom of 1,000 arms. As Su Qin breathed, the air in the hall moved slightly. The shadow of the 1,000 arms moved slowly, like they were alive. Su Qin took a deep breath. Then he held his breath and narrowed his eyes into a thin line. His left hand grasped an extremely pure white crystal. The fingertips of his already crippled fingers actually continuously drew on the white crystal, leaving behind traces that only he could understand. Chapter 721. Because of the records and deductions in the Chu Palace, he was certain that the method of the 9th hall was what he needed. His cultivation experience in Celestial Seal Sect allowed him to record the method of this statue. But he did not have much time left. He did not try to figure out and understand the meaning of any seal script or picture. He did not consider if he could master this method in the future. He just used his fastest speed to record the method of the 9th hall onto the crystal in his hand. The flow of time was meaningless to a cultivator like him who had forgotten himself. When he finished carving the last seal script, he took a deep breath, opened his mouth, and swallowed the white crystal. After finishing all this, he calmly calculated the time. In the next moment, he used his fastest speed to pass through multiple formation barriers and entered the last hall of the 12 shaman temples, the 12th hall. In the instant that he entered the 12 palaces, a certain array at the bottom of the witch god statues and the array pestle he carried with him had a strange reaction. Following that, a hoarse sound came from the bottom of the gigantic witch god statue, and the entire witch god statue slowly moved to one side. In the records of the past, when that invincible patriarch died, his disciples fought each other, and a splinter in the ancestral hall took advantage of the chaos to steal the heads of the 12 shamans, forcing his way out of the ancestral hall's main gate to escape. However, it was precisely those records that concealed the truth. Back then, the splitter had only killed all the guardians in the ancestral hall and faked an escape route through the main entrance. In reality, His true escape route was beneath the 12 sorcerer god temples. Now that the hidden formation was activated, and the formation I Pestle arrived here, the hidden passageway appeared again. Accompanied by a humid breeze, Bai Shanshui and Li Yunrui appeared in front of him. The water vapor blowing up from the bottom of the river was ordinary to the mortal world, but to the ancestral hall, it was an alien energy they had never encountered before. When the water vapor blew onto the shaman statue and the surrounding walls, the color of the statue quickly dimmed. The surrounding black crystal walls even showed some cracks, and small pieces started to peel off. The hard crystal caused some damage to Su Qin's throat when he swallowed it, causing him some discomfort. He coughed lightly and looked at Bai Shanshui, who was sizing up the sorcerer god temple as if no one else was there, and said directly, "You have to give me some time. I want to go to the seventh palace." "Why?" Bai Shanshui looked at the sorcerer god statue with great interest. Her eyes were filled with admiration and amazement. She did not look at Su Qin. Instead, she said with a trace of disdain, "I've already given you what you want. This is not part of the deal. This concerns my life." Su Qin looked at Bai Shanshui. His expression did not change. He said coldly, "Zheng Xiu has such orders, so I must complete them. Otherwise, when I leave the ancestral hall, she will not guarantee my safe return to the Chu capital. If I'm going to die after I go out, then there's no point for me to help you. But if you insist that this is not part of the deal, then I can carve 2 copies of the method from the seventh palace. One for Zheng Xiu to save her life, and one for you. This way, even if she can use some of the contents of this method with the Bazin Kendo ground's abilities, since it has obtained this method, it will have a way to counter it." The 12 Sorcerer God method describes the Yin energy method to the extreme. It would be a pity to destroy them all. Hearing Su Qin say this, Bai Shanshui smiled. "According to what you say, we will not lose out." Su Qin's eyebrows rose slightly. He did not hesitate to hand the formation I Pestle in front of Bai Shanshui. At the same time, he said, "When I go out, I will destroy the 12 Sorcerer God statues." For Bai Shanshui, Su Qin was not a good person, but at most he was a dangerous cub. Also, she knew that her and Li Yunrui's life and death had little to do with Su Qin right now. People like Su Qin cared more about how to climb up and how far they could climb in the future, and would not go overboard now. So she was not worried that Su Qin would play tricks. She smiled faintly and said, "Yes." Su Qin looked deeply at Bai Shanshui and smiled inexplicably. At this time, Bai Shanshui was as rebellious as before, and even prouder in front of him. He knew that right now, he and Bai Shanshui were like a wild wolf and a phoenix. But the more a woman was like this, the more attractive she was in his eyes. Looking at the proud and beautiful Bai Shanshui when she smiled, he thought inside that one day he would make a woman like this kneel in front of him. Only then would he be satisfied. Less than half of the young geniuses of the Qi dynasty had entered the 12 Sorcerer God Temple. These people had stopped at the first 3 halls. Even if they wanted to enter the Sorcerer God Temple, they were blocked by the formation and could not pass through. These young geniuses did not even know what was happening outside. They thought that this was the arrangement of the ancestral hall, and could only comprehend the Sorcerer God statue in front of them. Su Qin, Bai Shanshui, and Li Yunrui easily entered the 7th hall. In the empty 7th hall, the enormous Sorcerer God statue was completely silver gray. The cold star energy on their bodies dyed their bodies a strange fluorescent gray. On the surface of the Sorcerer God statue, the cold star energy and Yin energy merged strangely, forming energy crystals that looked like ice flowers. "It seems that you are more dangerous than I imagined." Bai Shanshui frowned and said to Su Qin, "These energy crystals that formed in the air and then quickly disappeared did not seem to have any pattern, and did not form seal scripts that she was familiar with. There were no special diagrams on the Sorcerer God statue, but Su Qin clearly saw seal meanings from these ice flowers and quickly started to record on the same white crystal. "If you change your mind, it may not be too late to kill me now," Su Qin said. Bai Shanshui did not respond and frowned slightly. It was not that Su Qin's words made her uncomfortable, but that the yin energy in the hall was so thick that she started to feel great pressure. With each breath, she had to use a lot of vital energy to resist the invasion of the yin energy. The Qi Emperor outside should have sensed something is wrong, Li Yunrui said softly. I wonder what he is feeling right now. Although his voice was low, there was an indescribable joy in it. He was from the Chu, and had once been the Chu Emperor's most trusted death soldier. He was naturally the cultivator most loyal to the Chu. He naturally felt great hatred towards the Qi Emperor, who had betrayed the agreement and caused the Chu dynasty to break apart. Chapter 722. No one knew what the Emperor of Qi was feeling right now. It was deathly silent outside the ancestral hall. The Qi officials gathered here, as well as more than half of the powerful cultivators of the Qi dynasty, could all see that the formation of the ancestral hall was changing. The entire black, crystal-like mountain was faintly emitting a dark green luster. Even in the dark night, it was very clear. Moreover, all the cultivators could feel an indescribable vibration. This vibration made them feel as if the protective array was resisting something. What made people feel the clearest was that in the air outside the mountain of ancestors, there was a lot of energy surging outwards, like many black and gold thorns growing outwards. Something unexpected had clearly happened in the ancestral hall. However, the people outside could not know what was happening inside. Not even a sound could be heard from inside. The Emperor of Qi pressed his lips together. He still stood calmly, but his face uncontrollably paled. The 12 shamans were not just the hope of the Qi dynasty's revival. They were what he relied on to win the hearts of the people and the fervent support of the people of the Qi dynasty. For the 12 shamans, he did not just betray Yining, who was respected by all of the Qi cultivation world, but also betrayed an ally like Yin Qi. He did not dare to think what price he would have to pay if this matter did not succeed. I fear we have all overlooked something. Him Yejing's deep and cold voice sounded next to him. We have all overlooked the 5 temple guards. The Emperor of Qi and the officials around him stopped breathing. The 5 temple guards should be the Qi cultivators most loyal to the ancestral hall. They had dedicated their lives to this formation. Yet, because of the pure yin energy of the ancestral hall, one day of cultivation in the ancestral hall was equivalent to more than a dozen days of cultivation outside. Their cultivation speed was more than 10 times faster than ordinary cultivators. So each generation of temple guards had 10 times more cultivation time than ordinary cultivators. Even those with mediocre talent could enter Realm 7. These 5 temple guards had entered Realm 7 at different times. The earliest had entered Realm 7 decades ago, and the latest had entered more than a decade ago. Yet these 5 temple guards were all Realm 7. Everyone who heard Him Yejing's words knew what he meant. Because he was worried that the grandmasters of the Qi dynasty had thoughts of personal gain. The Qi Emperor had chosen young geniuses who were absolutely loyal to the Qi dynasty to enter the ancestral hall. The highest cultivation was only Realm 6. If these young people had any strange movements, the 5 palace guards could easily stop them. The 5 guardians had given everything they had to the ancestral hall. However, that was under the premise that there was no peerless technique in the ancestral hall. Now that the 12 shamans had returned, who could guarantee that the 5 guardians wouldn't have any other thoughts? Most importantly, the formation of the ancestral hall could only be controlled by the 5 guardians. At this moment, it was cut off from the outside world and no information was leaked. In Him Yejing's view, even if a cultivator like Yuan Wu came in person, he could not finish off the 5 palace guards in such a short time and then change the formation to isolate the Qi people outside. There's enough food in this mountain. The palace guards can stay in there for 100 years. Him Yejing said coldly. They monopolize the techniques on the 12 shamans. As long as they are willing, they can cultivate the techniques on the 12 shamans before coming out. No one responded to what he said. Everyone felt this was very possible. If the 5 palace guards cultivated the techniques of the 12 shamans and came into the world, then they would be stronger than the 12 disciples of the ancestral master. No one could predict what such people would do after they appeared in the world. He Miejing looked at the Qi Emperor. Everyone was waiting for the Qi Emperor's orders. If they attacked the mountain forcefully, the formation would be destroyed, and the 12 shamans would be completely destroyed. Then everything they had done before would be meaningless. Maybe it is just the movement of the formation itself. Emperor Qi took a deep breath and said slowly. However, he felt an inexplicable dizziness. Done. Su Qin's forehead was sweating slightly. Because he had used up large amounts of vital energy and mind, his face was unusually pale. He took a deep breath and handed the 2 white crystals in his hand to Bai Shanshui. HM? Bai Shanshui narrowed her eyes slightly and was slightly surprised. The seal scripts on these are the methods of Celestial Seal Sect. I do not have the time to explain to you. These 2 crystals are exactly the same. But since this is a transaction, to prevent you from worrying, I will give them to you. You can find a direct disciple of Celestial Seal Sect and see the truth. Su Qin looked at her and smiled arrogantly. He said, in any case, Zhang Yi is a disciple of Celestial Seal Sect. You have a candidate and do not have to work hard. Also, since Bai Shanshui promised, I think she will not deceive me. Bai Shanshui casually put away the 2 white crystals and said, in this way, you have some of the boldness of a great rebel. Su Qin's smile grew brighter and showed his white teeth. This is just the beginning. In the future, when I am in the Chu capital, you will have use for me. Bai Shanshui looked deeply at Su Qin and said slowly, I underestimated you. In the future, I fear that you will be much stronger than the marquises of the Qin dynasty. Su Qin bowed slightly to her. Thank you for your praise. Are you ready after this matter? Bai Shanshui asked, putting away her smile. Su Qin did not stand and said, of course, I am ready. I do not want to stay here for a moment longer. Then I will send you out. Bai Shanshui smiled proudly. Without any pause, the true essence in her body began to surge. The array formation pestle in her hand became extremely red, as if it was burning. It began to blossom with flames like the tail of a phoenix. The energy in the hall sensed her presence. Black, jade-like energy flooded in from the other halls towards her like countless demons. At the same time, with a boom, Su Qin activated the remaining 2 stone seals in his hand. A thick and sinister presence formed a ball of light that protected him. In the next moment, there was a muffled boom. Bai Shanshui's explosive power collided violently with the yin qi in the hall. Coupled with the strong throbbing of the formation due to the formation pestle, a terrifying power kept exploding in the hall. With the hall as the center, the heads of the 12 shamans that had just been placed separated from their bodies. The flames on the shamans turned into countless swords that attacked the walls. Under the pressure of the wildly expanding energy, any passageway to the outside became the exit of a hurricane. With a pop, Su Qin vomited blood. His body was swept up by the wild energy. He charged out of the door of the hall and into the sky. In this moment, he was still able to maintain his clarity. Looking down, he saw the entire ancestral hall erupt like a volcano. The entire mountain seemed to jump up. The officials and cultivators of the Qi dynasty surrounded the mountain in shock, like it was the end of the world. Black, jade-like crystals and the severed limbs of the young cultivators sprayed out. In this moment, other than the few young cultivators flying around him who had not died, most of them were pieces of flesh and the remains of the shaman statues. Chapter 7:23. All the officials of the Qi dynasty, all the powerful cultivators present, looked up in shock and bewilderment. The black, jade-like energy in the mountains surged into the sky, turning into black clouds thicker than ink. They cast a heavy shadow into their eyes and turned their eyes completely black. At this moment, the sky of the Qi dynasty was black. All of these cultivators of the Qi dynasty, who had placed their hopes on the future, all of their bright future, seemed to be covered by a dark night, an eternal nightmare. Those young cultivators who had been knocked unconscious or seriously injured by the invisible barrier in the 12 shamans when the formation changed could not withstand such a power, and were all torn to pieces. Of the 100 young geniuses, as far as the eye could see, they were floating in the air. Their bodies still had essence chi protecting them, so they should be able to survive. However, only 10 or 20% of them could survive. In this storm, the most eye-catching were the 5 enormous balls of light. The 5 huge black balls of light exuded a powerful aura that made many of the grandmasters present palpitate. A lot of yin chi was extracted from the black crystal-like fragments that had been ejected from the mountain and was directed toward the 5 huge balls of light. Why is it like this? The Chi Emperor's eyes were also black. He felt that his entire body was surrounded by darkness. He was constantly falling into the boundless darkness. He could sense that these 5 balls of light were the 5 palace guards. However, even if his mind was completely blank, he was certain that the 5 palace guards definitely did not have the time to look through all the techniques on the 12 shaman gods, much less use any method to destroy the 12 shaman gods. He had guessed many possibilities before, but had not expected this result. Plop, plop. When the wild energies turned into hurricanes in the sky, everything that was swept out, including the young cultivators who were too injured to control their bodies, fell into the water along with the rubble and the remains of the shaman god. Some of the shards, remains, and even limbs fell onto the nether floats, giving off despairing sounds. When the sound of hard objects hitting the nether floats pierced their eardrums, many of the Chi officials who had been standing dazedly, as though their bodies had stopped moving, gave off all kinds of sounds. In a flash, many people started to cry. Some people hit the ground with their heads. Some cried heart-wrenchingly and completely lost their composure. The Chi Emperor was surrounded by such sounds. This should have been a time of celebration, but it all turned into sorrow. He moved his lips as though he wanted to say something, but when he opened his mouth, he could not even breathe properly. He could not make any sound, and a mouthful of blood sprayed out of his mouth. Miejing's teeth clattered. The aura on his body continued to expand, and the chilly wind began to howl, as if countless ghosts were howling violently. His face was slightly twisted. His eyes narrowed into slits as he looked towards the mountain where the ancestral hall was. At this time, only a Realm 7 Grandmaster like him could discover the abnormality. A jade-green water column that was clearly different from the black yin energy of the ancestral hall rushed out. At the same time, the sky responded, and a huge amount of water vapor gathered from all directions. In an instant, it condensed into a crystal-clear water droplet that fell from the sky. That glowing water droplet was very small, but it carried an indomitable and unstoppable aura. It instantly pierced through the berserk black energy. One sky water, ye ceiling? Miejing's eyes suddenly opened and shot out tangible cold light. However, in the next moment, that sparkling and translucent water pillar collided with the dark green water pillar, gushing out of the ancestral hall, and exploded in all directions. The sound of water could not be heard, but there was a faint, graceful, and bold singing. Many of the frozen Chi dynasty cultivators couldn't help but tremble. This was like an illusion, but the singing seemed to come from far away. It gathered a powerful water energy to attack the world, and was extremely real. Graceful and bold seemed to be complete opposites, but there was someone who perfectly fused them together. In this moment, Miejing did not need to listen carefully. The image of a cultivator holding a sword and walking in Chongling appeared in his mind. That person was a woman, but she was bolder than most men in the world. Bai Shan Shui. He squeezed this person's name out of his teeth. Boom, boom, boom. In this moment, many powerful presences charged out of the 4 nether floats and charged into the water below. The turbulent bottom of the river seemed to have countless black dragons fighting, and was unimaginably chaotic. The Chi Grandmasters on the 4 nether floats reacted. Their fury was not just because the 12 shamans of the Ancestral Hall had been destroyed, but also because of Bai Shan Shui's disdain and provocation towards the cultivators of the Qi dynasty. Yet Miejing did not move. On the other two nether floats from the Chu capital, there were multiple grandmasters who did not move. Especially when the evolved Jing masters heard the song, their faces were filled with bitter smiles. In the river outside the Chu capital, Bai Shanshui knew she could not do it. She knew she was not a match, but still resisted an attack from the nether floats. She was expressing her attitude to the cultivators of the Qi dynasty. Under that attack, Bai Shanshui was wounded and fled. But they and the cultivators of the Qin dynasty still lost track of Bai Shanshui. Now here the song was wrapped in energy. When the energy dissipated and the sound waves came out, the person was long gone. Also, the energy in the ancestral hall was rampaging, and the water vapor filled the world. They could not accurately sense Bai Shanshui's escape path, so how could they stop her? To them, the faint singing voice was not only graceful and bold, but also carried a kind of pleasure and mockery. They thought of how they had ridden the nether floats to attack the Chu capital. She had seen, but could not do anything. Now it was an eye for an eye. They had seen the ancestral hall destroyed, but could not do anything. It was like Bai Shanshui had come back to collect debts. In the chaotic river water, there was the sound of heavy objects falling into the water. Then there were the sounds of the cultivators breaking through the air and the gasps of the nether floats. Cold and dazed, the Qi emperor looked towards the sound and saw officials jumping into the water. Shocked, disappointed, and even hopeless officials of the Qi dynasty jumped into the chaotic water to seek death. Many of them were not cultivators, and many of them were famed officials of the Qi dynasty. At this time, such a scene filled the Qi emperor's eyes. The sound of people falling into the water turned into a voice that smashed into his ears. This is not their fault. If they seek death, can you live? Chapter 724. In this moment, the Emperor of Qi looked at the turbid river water in front of him. He really had the thought of destroying his cultivation and jumping down to die. But hearing the endless cries around him, he closed his eyes in pain. He knew he still had an unfinished road to walk. In the deep sea, on the snail ship, Lin Zhujiu was really making wine. A thread of energy coming out of his fingertips gathered the burning presence of the sunlight, turning into a floating flame that held a pot of wine. Zhang Shiwu was seriously fishing. He only used an ordinary fishing line. Using his perception, he had this fishing line swim in the water and pierce through the fattest fish in the deep sea. After staying on the sea for these days, he was very experienced. He knew which fish had the most delicious meat. He just needed to cut it raw and dip it in some special sauce from Jiaodong Commandery, and it would be a delicacy that the nobles of Chongling could not imagine. The wine was warm. A fat fish had taken the bait. It was cleaned and sliced. Zhang Shiwu placed the pink fish slices neatly on a stone slab like bright peach blossom petals. Enough! After cutting 10 slices, Lin Zhujiu smiled slightly at Zhang Shiwu and said. Zhang Shiwu stilled and looked with slight surprise at Lin Zhujiu. In the past, when the great nobles of Chongling ate the fish slices of Jiaodong Commandery, they only took the best 10 slices of each fish. Lin Zhujiu looked at him with a smile and said, "You naturally like to take care of flowers and plants and make these foods. We said in the past, if you marry someone, that woman will be fortunate. Your 10 slices of fish are taken from the best parts of the fish. While we are not like the great nobles of the past, there are fish everywhere on the sea. You throw away the leftovers, it is not a waste. They will immediately become food for other fish. Also, we have guests today, the eldest miss of the Zhangsun family. She has seen all kinds of beautiful things and should pay attention to them." Zhang Shiwu heard the first half of the sentence. When the matter of marriage was mentioned, he thought of that woman from Chongling. His face heated slightly, but when he heard the end, his expression grew solemn, and he said in realization, "Yes." Then he threw the remaining fish meat into the sea. He washed his hands, and in a few breaths caught another big fish. At this time, he stopped and looked up with Lin Zhujiu. Dark clouds suddenly appeared in the calm sky. Accompanied by a rumbling sound, a huge shadow emerged from the dark clouds. The soaring serpent had arrived. The arrival of the soaring serpent was the arrival of their long-awaited old friend. Lin Zhujiu and Zhang Shiwu were deeply moved. This time, they had only waited on the sea for around 10 days. However, this time, they had reunited after more than 10 years, or even a lifetime. A soaring serpent broke through the clouds and descended towards the sea. Many people had followed Ding Ning to Jiaodong Commandery, but on the back of this flying snake, there was only Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinxue. This was just as Lin Zhujiu had expected, because this was a very special meeting. Before Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinxue landed on the snail ship, they just looked at each other from a distance. Lin Zhujiu saw many familiar meanings. He confirmed that Yuan Wu was speaking the truth and sighed softly. It really is you? Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinxue landed on the snail ship. Ding Ning looked at Lin Zhujiu and Zhang Shiwu and was silent for a moment. Previously, did you not say that the 9-death silkworm was unknown to you, and you did not dare to cultivate it? You only cultivated it when you fought your way into Chongling? Lin Zhujiu looked at Ding Ning and asked. Ding Ning slowly nodded and said, "It is said that one can survive 9 deaths, but who has the courage to try dying once? Since there is no precedent, I suspect that Emperor Yu in the past was deliberately mystifying to trick his opponents into cultivating this method. When the Battle of Chongling came, the Grand Masters of the world gathered and found they could not fight their way into the imperial palace, so they cultivated it." Lin Zhujiu said. And then, Ding Ning said, "My consciousness is trapped in endless darkness, like a cocoon underground, neither dead nor alive. While I have perception, I cannot judge where I am. Without flesh and blood, I do not know how long it has been. Only when I am reborn and see the sun again, do I know that 3 years have passed. Not knowing if I am dead or alive, forever trapped in endless darkness. That is much worse than me in the water prison." Lin Zhujiu looked at him and said, meeting again after a long separation. But when they spoke of this, both Lin Zhujiu and Ding Ning did not have a smile on their faces, because the past was full of bitterness. "No wonder I heard that when you first became famous in Chongling, Xin Xian saw you. There is no problem with your bone age. But that old Emperor Yu's method is not fake. Come, drink, eat." Zhang Shiwu's voice sounded. His eyes were moist. Many years ago, he had been a farmer. Later, he became a famed swordsman of the Bazin Kendo ground. Later, he lived in seclusion in Chongling as a gardener. His personality had not changed and was as simple as when they first met. Hearing this voice and looking at the wine in the cup, Ding Ning was inexplicably dazed. There seemed to be more people around him, just like when they were drinking in the woods of Chongling many years ago. Zhang Shiwu raised his cup. He glanced at Zhang Sun Qinxue and could not help but feel shy. But he could not help but smile. He said sincerely to Zhang Sun Qinxue and Ding Ning, "Congratulations." Hearing this, Lin Zhujiu could not help but laugh. So the bitterness on the ship was over, like the winter snow melting and the spring flowers blooming. A faint blush appeared on Zhang Sun Qinxue's face. "Drink." Lin Zhujiu drank all the wine in the cup and picked up a piece of fish that looked like a peach blossom. At this time, there was the sound of wind and clouds in the distance. A faint roar rang out, followed by a violent presence that spread through the surroundings. The soaring serpents in the air felt extreme fear and fled uncontrollably. Ding Ning frowned slightly. He looked in the direction of the sound and quickly saw some of the white mist being scattered by the violent presence. Then he saw the outline of the floating city. He had seen many miraculous things in his life. Seeing a floating city like this, he could not help but feel shocked. He sighed like Lin Zhujiu when he first saw the city. So the true Jiaodong Commandery is like this. When he said this, he deliberately released his presence, including the sharp sword energies hidden in his body. Countless transparent sword lights blossomed from the surroundings of the conch ship, like a magnificent fireworks in the daytime. In the distant floating city, the violent aura suddenly dissipated. The thing that emitted that ruthless aura immediately gave off a feeling of joy, as if it had sensed the arrival of an old friend. Along with the sea breeze that spread outwards, a grand sound could be faintly heard. However, this time it was not an angry roar. Instead, it was the sound of a baby crying out in joy. Chapter 725. What is that? Zhang Sun Qinxue frowned slightly and could not help but ask. She was certain that this was an enormous beast stronger than the soaring snake, and it should be enormous. The amount of energy stored in its body should be astounding. It is the Jie fish. Ding Ning looked at her. He knew that she would not understand even if she heard the name. He slowly explained. In the ancient legends, it is an enormous dragon that is half dragon and half fish. In the legends of the islands, it is the incarnation of the rain god. In some of the ancient records of the cultivation world, there were accurate records that this was a type of strange beast. After it grew up, its body would have a circumference of 75 mu. Its sea of qi was incomparably vast, and its most powerful aspect was that it could directly absorb all of the origin energy in the world into its sea of qi. Therefore, even if a Realm 7 mountain-moving Grandmaster were to face it, if they were to face it, they would probably find that they would not be able to move much energy. When it was young, it was not large, just over 10 feet long. It flew very quickly and had a restless personality. Ding Ning did not conceal anything. He looked at her with clear eyes and said, "The reason I am familiar with it is because when Zheng Xiu first entered Chongling, it was Zheng Xiu's steed." Zhang Sun Qinxue reacted. Rainbow fish? Ding Ning nodded. When it was young, it looked like a colorful flying fish. When it flew, it would be shrouded in water vapor, and a rainbow would form. So those people who saw it but did not know its name called it rainbow fish. I really do not understand why she is such an idiot. Zhang Sun Qinxue could not help but be angry. When she was angry, true coldness formed. White frost danced in the air in front of her. Back then, when she entered Chongling on the rainbow fish, many geniuses admired her. She quickly formed a good relationship with the Bazinkendo ground and defeated the 3 dynasties. She was also an immortal companion with the strongest cultivator in the world. Is there anything more glorious than this? She was the envy of all the women in the world, but she turned to Yuan Wu. Even though she became the highest person in Chongling, in the eyes of ordinary women, she most likely lost her original glory. Zhang Sun Qinxue continued coldly. How many girls still envy her now? At that time, I didn't understand, but now I do. Someone like her would never care about other people's opinions. She only cares about the heights she can see. She must climb to the heights she can see but never reach. Only when she stands there and looks back will she think about the past. Lin Zhujiu took a sip of warm wine. Looking at the floating city in the mist, he said coolly, "These beasts still remember old friends. They are more humane than her." Other than Jieyu, are there other Jiaodong commandery cultivators on the floating cities? Ding Ning looked at Lin Zhujiu and asked. In his eyes, Lin Zhujiu was much older than a dozen years ago. But thinking of the countless things they had done together, even if Lin Zhujiu did nothing, just standing there gave him confidence. Right now, he was not going to destroy the floating city of Jiaodong Commandery, but to take over the treasuries that Jiaodong Commandery had accumulated over hundreds of years. He had to make sure that before he got on the floating city, no one would destroy everything inside. That is almost a dead city. Lin Zhujiu laughed scornfully and said, "In each generation of Jiaodong Commandery, people like her do not trust anyone, much less give everything inside to someone to manage. So other than this Jieyu, there are only a few medicine slaves guarding the treasuries, Realm 7 cultivators who lost their minds with medicine. They're just walking corpses. I fear that Zheng Xiu added this Jieyu later to prevent her family from getting close, and using the things inside against her without her consent. I rarely admire a person's stratagem and intelligence, but she is one of the people I admire." Lin Zhujiu ate another piece of fish, and let the delicious taste dissolve the last bit of bitterness in the wine. Then he said, "This Jieyu absorbs the primal energies of the universe and the surroundings. This way, if her family members want to enter the floating city without her consent, They will not be able to deal with the medicine slaves on the floating city after being sucked in by the Jiayu. As he spoke, he glanced at Ding Ning and Zhangsun Qinxue, but did not say anything. He turned to look at the vast sea. He had known Wang Jingming for a longer time than Zheng Xiu back then, and knew everything about Wang Jingming and Zheng Xiu. Zheng Xiu and Wang Jingming had been an immortal couple that all the scholars and beauties in the world admired back then. They had had a long period of sweetness. Back then, the rainbow fish had accompanied Wang Jingming and Zheng Xiu for a long time. Zheng Xiu had subdued the rainbow fish as a steed when it was young and raised it herself. After the change in Chongling, Zheng Xiu had become so cold that no one could get close to her. This rainbow fish became a Jiayu and hid in the floating city in the deep sea. Other than Wang Jingming, no one else could get close to it. Other than Zheng Xiu, Wang Jingming was its second master. He knew these things, and so did Zhangsun Qinxue. But he also knew that if he mentioned it, Zhangsun Qinxue would not be happy. True friends would let their friends have more time to be happy, especially after experiencing countless life and death situations. When his eyes grew old, Lin Zhujiu had learned to think less about unhappy things, mention less about them, and think more about happy things. Just like the good wine and good food now, they could make people reminisce and think of happy things. Ding Ning nodded and was not in a hurry. Ding Ning caught several more fish, cut them to the best parts, and drank and ate. When he was full, Ding Ning had the snail ship move towards the floating city. Since it is nostalgia, it is much simpler. Old friend, I need to borrow your power. When the snail ship neared the white mist that shrouded the floating city, Ding Ning said seriously when he heard the enormous sound of water. His body floated up from the snail ship. In this moment, an enormous wave, dozens of feet tall, formed in front of the snail ship. Behind the gigantic wave, a gigantic creature rose from the bottom of the sea. It was glowing with a black, oily light, like a giant whale in the sea. However, even the largest whale in the sea was not as large as this creature. Zhang Shiwu pressed lightly on the water, and the snail ship flew up. They saw even more clearly that this Jieyu was like a new island. It was not colorful like when it was young in Chongling, but black like oil. Its body was not like a flying fish, but half dragon and half fish. It looked extremely fat and round, but the presence it gave off was terrifyingly powerful. Chapter 726. This fish did not have a good appearance, and could even be described as ugly. It was half dragon and half fish, but it was like an enormous catfish head with a small dragon tail. It clearly sensed Ding Ning's presence, and knew that an old friend was close. So, in this moment, it seemed to have returned to the time when its body was light. It cheered, half of its body suddenly standing up, opening its mouth and giving off strange cries. But even in this moment of joy, its mouth was still like an abyss, intimidating. Its eyes were large, and its eyeballs were a strange orange-yellow and very bright. When it saw Ding Ning flying towards it, its eyes grew brighter and flashed with strange light. But when Ding Ning was close to it, less than 100 feet from the floating city, and when it sensed the presence of the other people on the snail ship, it seemed to think of its master's orders. An even more terrifying presence formed in the world. Its huge mouth closed, but the world darkened at this moment. In the senses of Lin Zhujiu and the others, the world in front of them seemed to have suddenly become empty, as though this giant beast had swallowed this part of the world. Hostility began to appear in its eyes. Along with the hostility, a killing intent that cultivators could clearly sense came like a tsunami. But Ding Ning did not stop at all. For him, this was the fish hesitating. If he also hesitated, he would not be able to get close. His body suddenly became light and graceful. The vital energy in his body gushed out quickly, but there was no sense of violence. Instead, it made his body seem like a gentle stream of energy. As the fish swallowed, it directly landed on its body. Just as it hesitated and did not have time to react, Ding Ning's hand landed softly on its body, just like he had touched it many years ago. His hand landed on its sea of chi. Separated by an incredibly thick layer of skin, his palm pressed down with the greatest amount of power he could muster. However, this power was still not berserk, but rather evenly pressed down on its entire chi sea. There was a loud boom. There was a great explosion above the sea. Not just the primal energies of the universe that had just been swallowed, but also the primal energies of the universe that had accumulated in the energy sea were all squeezed out by Ding Ning. When the primal energies of the universe were absorbed, they were invisible, but when they came out of the fish's body, they formed a magnificent pillar of energy that shot into the sky. A visible shock wave spread along the pillar of energy towards the sea, and caused the sea to create waves dozens of feet tall. The fish's energy sea was empty. It immediately felt terror and wanted to resist, but in the next moment, it felt its energy sea was clear and comfortable. This kind of comfort, like the dirt in its body and old bruises, was swept away. Then it saw Ding Ning's clear and gentle eyes. It immediately understood that Ding Ning had no ill intentions. Then it sensed what benefits Ding Ning's actions would bring it. Its eyes suddenly became brighter, simply and directly flashing with unprecedented happiness. Its body swelled, and its energy sea expanded. It used all its power to take a breath. With a boom, the world shook again. The magnificent seven-colored pillar of energy immediately dissipated. More primal energies of the universe were sucked in and flooded towards its energy sea. But before this, many bright rays of light had appeared between the seven-colored pillar of energy and the world. These rays of light were clear and transparent as they flooded into Ding Ning's body. Ding Ning's body bathed in the clear rays of light, holy and bright. The fish's swallowing had reached its limit. As it swallowed with all its might, its sea of chi swelled up like a balloon filled with air, and its entire body became completely round. Ding Ning did not stop and pressed his hand on his body again. Where the hand landed, thunder roared in the fish's energy sea. In its perception, there were also countless streaks of lightning descending, squeezing the primordial energy impurities in its energy sea that it could not absorb. Then it spat them out. Thunder roared, and holy rays of light formed in the air, gradually drowning Ding Ning's body. Thunder jail-shaking thunder, a method that the Wei Dynasty Thunder Mountain used to cleanse the energy sea. I had not expected him to use it like this. Only he could think of such a method. Zhang Shiwu looked at Ding Ning's body drowned in light, and the fish that was using all its power to swallow and spit. He shook his head and sighed. His personality had always been honest, and his words were honest. This scene was so profound it was like a miracle, but for him, Lin Zhujiao, and Zhang Sun Qinxue, it was not hard to understand. Ding Ning's method was not just him using a method from a former Wei Dynasty cultivation place to help the fish shake its energy sea. Even more importantly, he was using this to turn the fish into an enormous formation. In the records of cultivators, some sects could set up formations that could absorb large amounts of primal energies of the universe. Just like the man-made spirit veins, cultivating in this kind of formation would yield twice the results with half the effort. But such formations were limited in their ability to absorb primal energies of the universe, and could not compare to this fish. Hearing Zhang Shiwu's words, Zhang Sun Qinxue thought of many scenes in Chongling. She thought of the wall used to record matters and escape routes, and how he had to think of all the ways to kill Liang Lian. He had fallen from an invincible existence to cultivating anew. Many things that could be solved through simple battles required many schemes and luck to succeed. Whether it was in terms of revenge or cultivation, he had thought of countless possibilities in these years. She was inexplicably moved and started to feel happy for Ding Ning, who was in the light. She knew that by using the primal energies of the universe gathered by this fish, he could absorb the primal energies of the universe that were useful to his cultivation. His realm 7 cultivation would be completely stabilized. In this life, he had received the help of her energy and the heaven-replenishing divine art. In the process of cultivation, he had corrected many of the mistakes he had made in the past. Now that he had stabilized his realm 7, If one spoke of rebirth, he was truly reborn, returning to the Wang Jingming of the past. He did not have to hide and live like before. Ding Ning's body grew clearer and clearer. He raised his head. A pure starlight passed through the mist on the sea and entered his body. The star energy, guided by the heaven-replenishing divine art, cleansed some of the hidden wounds in the deepest parts of his body. In this moment, in the Qin dynasty, the Qi dynasty, the Chu dynasty, and even further places, many Realm 7 grandmasters suddenly stopped breathing. They felt the life bond swords in their bodies vibrate. Chapter 727. This was a kind of resonance between Realm 7. When large amounts of primal energies of the universe surged towards one place, and when some of the primal energies of the universe related to them were pulled in, these Realm 7 cultivators would naturally resonate with each other. Yet this kind of resonance usually existed when people were fighting nearby, or when someone suddenly had a breakthrough within dozens of miles. Life bond energy was the product of a cultivator's vital energy and the primal energies of the universe. It was completely different from the laws of the universe. Life bond energy was one's own energy. Other people could not even imitate the presence, much less cause their life bond items to resonate. The only possibility was that someone's understanding of life bond energy far surpassed them. In terms of sword essence and energy laws, this person covered the energy laws of their life bond items. In the world of cultivators, this meant that this person was above their cultivation. So when their life bond items vibrated, these grandmasters naturally felt awe. Other than a few young grandmasters like Li Shixing who had just reached Realm 7, the other grandmasters had lived for a long time, walked many paths, and seen many things ordinary people could not imagine. But in their understanding, especially those who had entered or approached Chongling in the past, and those who had not reached Realm 7 when the Bazinkindo ground was at its peak, only one cultivator in the world could cause such a resonance. That person was the publicly acknowledged sword leader after the Zhao dynasty was destroyed and the grandmaster of the Zhao sword furnace died, Wang Jingming of the Bazinkindo ground. When he fought his way into Chongling and faced the grandmasters from all over the world, the sword in his hand had caused the energy resonance of almost all cultivators in Chongling. Some low-level cultivators were so shocked they could not hold their swords. Their swords fell to the ground and trembled in Wang Jingming's direction as though they were worshipping him. This was the true scene of swords worshipping in the world of cultivators. Now, in many people's memories, that familiar scent appeared. Even if it was only for a very short moment, the kind of reverence spontaneously arose, that kind of supreme and invincible feeling. Many people were immediately certain that that person had returned. In Chongling, there was a cultivator who was not young compared to Li Shixing, but much younger than the other grandmasters. He silently sensed this resonance that was rarely seen in the cultivation world for hundreds or even thousands of years. He was the commander of the god-slaying army, Bai Qi. Unlike other people, he had fought an unusually fierce battle with Ding Ning. When he returned to Chongling, he started to investigate and ponder many questions. So from the resonance of his life bond energy, he sensed more and more than other cultivators. When he looked in the direction of Jiaodong Commandery, the scene that appeared in his mind was that Ding Ning was also looking at Chongling. But it was different from his gaze. In his mind, Ding Ning was looking down at Chongling from a high place, his gaze sorrowful. At this moment, Bai Qi was enlightened. When a person was truly invincible, there would be many despicable methods that he would disdain to use or even think of using. Some people were already strong enough, but they had never been able to become the world's top swordsman. They had never been truly invincible. The resonance of primordial qi only lasted for an instant. However, Bai Qi remained silent for a long time. Then he started to walk out of the imperial mausoleum. The god-slaying army had been the assassin army of the previous emperor of the Qin dynasty, and then guarded the coffin of the previous emperor. After Zheng Xiu took control of Chongling, the god-slaying army completely changed and became a ghost army that was born for revenge. But now, the god-slaying army no longer existed. When Yi Xiling and Xin Xian left Chongling, the people around Zhengxiu died one by one. Chongling needed new leaders, or rather, the mistress of the imperial palace needed new powerful supporters. So when the order came, he walked out of the shadows into the sunlight. He went from the commander of the god-slaying army to the vice bureau chief of the warden's office. He was also certain that in a short time, he would go from vice bureau chief to bureau chief. Many armies and generals in the Chu had used silence to respond to the orders of the mistress of Chongling. She had to have someone strong enough and cold-blooded enough to control the warden's office, and then regain control of most armies and generals. His advancement is much faster than I imagined. Yuanwu looked up and said slowly to Shufu in front of him. His carriage had entered the Qin and was leisurely passing through the lands of Guanzhong. In half a day, the carriage would reach one of the most important cities in Guanzhong, Chongluo. He was one of the people most familiar with Ding Ning. When he saw Ding Ning attack with his own eyes, he was certain that Ding Ning was not the heir to the 9-death silkworm, but the rebirth of the 9-death silkworm. So the resonance of his life bond energy was exceptionally strong. His entire sea of qi, and even his spirit, seemed to be vibrating violently. Rings of pure and holy light kept spreading out around the chariot and toward the plains, dispelling all the dust. It was like a miracle. Shifu bowed his head. There was a faint red light coming out of his energy sea. If we fight now, I can win. He took a deep breath and slowly responded to Yuanwu. Yuanwu smiled faintly. Of course, he understood Shifu's meaning. He also knew that Shifu spoke the truth. Someone like Shifu, who was never proud, said such words to comfort him so that he would not be impatient. You can win now, but soon, can you win against him? He looked at Shifu, and then his smile faded. He shook his head and said softly, maybe soon, even if I recover from my wounds, you and I together may not win against him. Shifu looked up and said, there will be other ways. In a certain part of Guanzhong, in a quiet house, there was a lotus pond. In the bamboo building next to the lotus pond, the handsome Yi Xinhe sat cross-legged. He had been a famed swordsman of the Bazin Kendo ground in the past, one of the giants of the Qin dynasty against the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties. But those battles, including the battle at the Deer Mountain Conference where he had almost died, and time had not left any marks on his face. His life bond energy was also resonating. Many tiny bolts of lightning fell from the sky into the lotus pond, bringing with them inexplicable life, causing the lotuses to grow furiously and bloom. Sensing such a resonance and the return of an old friend, this Bazin Kendo ground swordsman did not feel any terror or anxiety, but a faint scornful smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. This kind of emotion was incomprehensible, but no one knew what he was thinking, because no one knew why he had betrayed the Bazin Kendo ground and Wang Jingming. Chapter 7:28. There was never love or hate for no reason, and there would never be betrayal for no reason. For example, Liang Lian. His betrayal of the Bazin Kendo ground was easy to understand. Because of his low status, if he had not sold out the whereabouts of Lin Zhujiu and the others, he would not have been able to climb up. For him, this kind of betrayal was a ladder to climb up. But Yi Xinhe was different. He did not seem to have great desire for power. If he had not acted at the Deer Mountain Conference, the cultivators of the world would not know that he stood on Yuanwu and Zhengxiu's side. In these years, he had lived a secluded life with few desires, and did not occupy the position of marquis. Some people betrayed because of feelings. For example, they liked the same woman at the same time, but lost in the battle of feelings, and then hated. But Yi Xinhe and Zhengxiu did not have such feelings. Yi Xinhe was not someone who was afraid of death and would betray the Bazin Kendo ground, and not because of some cultivation method. He was the inheritor of one of the top methods of the Bazin Kendo ground. His combat power was determined by how much he had comprehended and progressed on his cultivation path. In his later conversations with Zhengxiu, Yi Xinhe revealed that he did not like Wang Jingming's words. But there would always be a reason. Also, The Bazinkindo ground was made up of many living members of the sect, and not just Wang Jingming alone. So after the Deer Mountain Conference, the people who were still alive in the Bazinkindo ground, when they heard news of Yixinhe, their first reaction was that he was still alive. Their second reaction was, why did he betray? Most of the time, Yixinhe was just like a spectator who was not involved in the drama. The large city of Guangzhou, Chongluo, was second in size to Chongling. But in terms of population and land, it did not lose to a large city like the Chu capital. Rich merchants gathered. While the Qin and Chu war was urgent and used up large amounts of manpower and resources, Chongluo did not appear desolate. Instead, resources from all over gathered in Guangzhou and then to the front lines. The Chu was in chaos. For the merchants of Guangzhou, trade was boundless. There were fewer taxes, and there were countless opportunities amidst danger. So Chongluo appeared even more prosperous and busy. Yuan Wu liked peace and quiet, so the carriage did not enter the city. Instead, it went directly to the palace outside Chongluo to rest. This palace was located at the riverside. Previously, it was a Dragon King temple. In the past, the caravans would first perform their rituals in this Dragon King temple, praying that everything would go smoothly and that nothing would go wrong. In the 5th year after Yuan Wu ascended the throne, he had toured the cities in Guangzhou. When he passed by Chongluo, he stayed here. Later, this Dragon King temple was turned into the temporary palace of the emperor. All kinds of trees were planted in the surroundings. While people often cleaned inside, no one lived here, so it was extremely quiet. In the emperor's palace, even if the emperor was not present, no one would dare to occupy the dragon bed. But when Yuan Wu's carriage arrived, Yuan Wu sensed that someone was living in the palace. However, his reaction was only a faint sigh. He got off the carriage and walked through the door. The only person who followed him into the temple was Su Fu. Even Fu Su was left behind in the carriage. "You've come?" He looked at the person under the largest tree in the temple and said, "Then who will watch over Chongling?" The words were calm, but contained reproach. The meaning was, I am not in Chongling, so how can you leave Chongling? The person standing under the large tree was Zheng Xiao. She had left Chongling and come here. She and Yuan Wu were not in Chongling at the same time. This was a very dangerous matter. But looking at Yuan Wu's faint expression and hearing his words, she said coolly, "The reason Chongling is important is because you and I are in Chongling." Yuan Wu heard more from the words "you and I" in her words. He was silent for a moment and then smiled slightly. He said, "Reasonable." Zheng Xiao looked calmly at him. She had not seen him much in Chongling, especially after the Spring War against the Chu. They had only met now. If she had not waited for him here ahead of time, maybe they would not meet again in Chongling for half a month. In this period of time, many things had happened between the two of them. But at this moment, her eyes were still calm. "Walk with me." After saying this, she turned around and walked towards the back of the palace. The Dragon King's palace was built facing the river with its back facing the mountain. There was a mountain path at the back that led straight up the mountain. She walked at the front all the way to the top of the mountain. Yuan Wu did not say anything, just calmly followed and stopped at the top of the mountain. She looked at the plains that the river led to and the distant scenery. A dozen breaths later, she turned around and looked at Yuan Wu and Su Fu, who was following behind him. She said, "I want you to walk with me, but I am worried. In the end, I need official Su to follow." Yuan Wu's eyebrows moved slightly. He looked deeply at her and said, "Yixinhe is not far from here." Zheng Xiao moved and brushed past him. As she went down the mountain, she said, "Everyone says I am cold, but you are colder than me." Yuan Wu took a deep breath. He wanted to say something, but in the end he suppressed it. He slowly raised his head and looked into the distance. He slowly said, "This is not important. What is important is whether we can still win." Zheng Xiao did not respond to him. She silently went down the mountain and then left the palace to return to Chongling. From Chongling to here, she and Yuan Wu had only spoken a few short words. She did not even mention Yuan Wu's deal with Ding Ning and his release of Miss Shang. But in this meeting, Both she and Yuan Wu had obtained the answers they wanted to know. A long time after she left, Yuan Wu turned around and looked in the direction she had left. A hint of pain flashed through his eyes. Maybe he was like when he had walked with her in Chongling many years ago, coming up the mountain alone. If he did not let Su Fu follow, she might give him the spirit spring lotus seed to heal him. But he could not take the risk, even if she had Yishina come here just to see his reaction. Some people did not dislike each other, but were disappointed in each other. Time would dilute everything, but also allow people to see everything clearly. In the deep sea, when the thunder in Jie Yu's body disappeared, the holy light around Ding Ning gradually disappeared. He stood on Jie Yu's back and nodded to Jie Yu. The fish sensed that he was going to go up the floating city behind him. But this time, it did not have any hostility. It was not that it had gained great benefits from Ding Ning helping it shake its energy sea, but that it had a great respect for Ding Ning who was standing on its back. It could clearly sense that Ding Ning could easily kill it with a thought, especially the life bond sword in Ding Ning's energy sea. At this time, in its perception, it was extremely sharp and it felt like it could not block it. Chapter 7:29. The Jie fish slowly sank. Ding Ning's figure passed through the white mist and officially stepped onto the secret land of Jiaodong Commandery. The place where he landed was actually a spotlessly white beach. When his perception went down, he knew that this floating island that floated along a fixed path in the sea due to the intersection of warm and cold currents was originally made from coral reefs. But Jiaodong Commandery had planted many strange watergrasses below. These watergrasses were like fine vines that wrapped around all the scattered objects below the island. The watergrasses were hollow inside and had great buoyancy. This caused the floating island to become more stable and buoyant over the years. The moment his feet touched the ground, the pure white beach instantly turned black. A dark energy surged out from the depths of the floating island and swept towards him. This dark power was different from the yin energy and ghosts that the cultivators of the Qi dynasty cultivated. It was not the condensation of energy from dead things, but some kind of vital energy that had been turned into a special substance after hundreds of years in a dark abyss. This kind of power was hard to deal with the cultivation methods commonly used in the world of cultivators. So when it landed in the perception of any cultivator, it was even more terrifying. The pure white beach turned black. The wind blew like enormous shadows sweeping towards Ding Ning. But Ding Ning had an indescribable bitter smile at the corners of his mouth. This was the power of the formation. It came from the former Yu Emperor, but he had told Jing Xiu about this Yu Emperor's power back then. In other words, on the basis of the original Jiaodong Commandery formation, Jing Xiu, who had been chosen by Jiaodong Commandery back then to be the ruler of Jiaodong Commandery's future, after obtaining the true Jiaodong Commandery, added a formation like this here. This formation, and the Jie fish loyal to her, formed two locks so that her family members in Jiaodong Commandery could not enter here. Other than herself, only the envoys she sent could enter and leave here. But this method came from him. Many years ago, she entered Chongling and stole everything from him and the Bazin Kendo ground. But she had never thought that he would appear here many years later and step onto her secret land. Ding Ning stretched out his right hand. He did not do anything extra and just let the 9-death silkworm flow out of his body. As countless tiny sounds surged out, countless invisible silkworms devoured the huge shadows. In the next instant, a series of soft cracking sounds came from the depths of the island. Those incomparably dark forces seemed to be afraid of their own destruction and suddenly collapsed into nothingness. The 9-death silkworm itself was the Yu Emperor's greatest skill, like the general outline of all these methods. For dark energy of this level, any thread of energy from the 9-death silkworm was extremely powerful. As the beach turned from black to white in an instant, the invisible force binding the fog on the island also disappeared. As the wind blew, the white fog on the floating island dissipated and became clear again. Zhang Shiwu, Lin Zhujiao and Zhang Sun Qinxue were on the snail ship that was approaching Ding Ning's beach. It was also at this moment that 4 streaks of murderous aura shot out from the 4 corners of the floating island. Each of them carried a thick medicinal aura as they shot towards Ding Ning. These were the island guards of Jiaodong Commandery, true death warriors. They had used all kinds of medicines to lose their minds, and were fearless and painless medicine slaves. Even more importantly, these medicine slaves were Realm 7 cultivators. Even though they had lost their minds and became machines that only knew killing because they had no emotions from a certain point of view, they were more terrifying than before, and some of their attacks were illogical. Just like this, the 4 medicine slaves' target was Ding Ning, who had reached the island first. Among the 4 fiendish energies, a black figure broke through the air and charged at the front. This was an enormous cultivator. His body was even larger than Marquis Su of Mount Hung of Chongling. Also, he had used some unknown medicine to stimulate his bones and flesh. He did not have any fat on his body, and his muscles were as sharp as rocks. This cultivator with such a large and robust body was actually much faster than the other 3 medicine slaves. Also, his attacks were unusually direct and illogical. He used his body to smash towards Ding Ning. He was like a black boulder thrown out by a catapult, simply and crudely smashing over. But in the process of flight, he constantly moved the mountainous energy and gathered it towards his body. In the air around him, as the energy continued to condense, countless twisted black lines appeared. These black lines were very similar to the patterns on the 100 refined iron of the Qin dynasty, like the patterns formed after the iron cooled after being folded and hammered. When he was 1,000 feet away from Ding Ning, he seemed to form an enormous round iron shield around him. He turned into an enormous shield. One of the 3 herb slaves behind him was tall and thin. His natal energy surged wildly in his hands, forming a dark blue long spear. The spear was over 30 feet long, and as he thrust forward, the dark blue tip of the long spear pierced through the black lines that looked like the patterns on the iron, and passed through the giant shield without any hindrance. This scene gave any cultivator the feeling that the first medicine slave had left a hole for the second medicine slave to use. Then the second medicine slave used his spear to accurately pass through this hole and stab towards Ding Ning. This spear was faster than the impact of the enormous shield, but it was not the fastest. Following closely behind the second medicine slave, the medicine slave who was also hiding behind the huge shield surged with his natal primordial chi, and a sword light flashed. His life-bond item was a serene green flying sword. This flying sword was so fast it gave off explosions in the air. As the air exploded, there seemed to be thousands of flying swords flying towards Ding Ning. Of the 4 medicine slaves, the last medicine slave's weapon was even more special. The moment he appeared, he held an enormous horn bow in his hands. The 2 ends of the bow were constantly spraying out strange mist and rippling with strong yuan qi. It was obvious that the bow was made from the horn of some kind of giant beast in the sea. Most likely, there was no need for arrows. Just by relying on the strength of the bow and his own Jin Yuan, he could condense a large amount of yuan qi and condense it into arrows. He did not carry a quiver like the archers of the Qin dynasty. He carried a long blade on his back and a short blade at his waist. This kind of attire was a personal servant who trained his body and reaction speed to surpass ordinary cultivators. In the army of the Qin dynasty, some swordsmen who used flying swords would have a personal servant like this. This kind of personal attendant could prevent a powerful swordsman from being killed by the sneak attacks of some low-level cultivators on the chaotic battlefield when the flying sword flew out with all his strength, or directly die from the accidental attack of some scattered energy-flowing flames. A shield with a spear, a flying sword personal servant, this was a powerful team of Qin dynasty cultivators. Now, the combination of these 4 cultivators was an even stronger team. Even more importantly, these 4 medicine slaves who used such a battle formation were all Realm 7 Grandmasters. When these 4 killing intents fell towards Ding Ning at the same time, Even the intelligent fish by the water felt the terror of the combined attack of these four cultivators. Its body trembled slightly. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.